Hey Dead Signal FM viewers, getting ready for bed? Wishing you a calm and cozy night. Before we start, where are you watching from and what time is it? Let's get started. The Borrowed Light. The first night after Marlene Collins moved to Pinewood Hollow, she woke at 3:17 a.m. to find her bedroom bathed in an unnatural glow. Not the cold blue light of the moon, which was nowhere to be seen in the clouded October sky, and not the warm yellow light of a street lamp either. There were no street lamps this far out in the hills of western Massachusetts. No, this was a sickly green-tinged white, like fluorescent bulbs on the verge of dying. She sat up, heart hammering. The glow seemed to pour in from her single-bedroom window, intensifying even as she watched. The pine trees outside her window should have been silhouettes against the night sky, but instead, they were clearly visible, their needles outlined in that eerie light. "What the hell?" she whispered. Marlene pushed back the covers and walked to the window. The floor beneath her bare feet felt unnaturally cold, even for autumn. She peered through the glass, up the gently sloping hill behind her small rental cottage. At the top of the hill, maybe 200 yards away, stood the old Pearson place, a Victorian monstrosity that had been abandoned for decades, according to her landlord. The house had been one of the reasons she'd chosen this remote spot. As a true crime writer and podcaster, she found the looming, dilapidated structure inspirational. She'd planned to research its history, maybe base an episode around whatever petty tragedies had occurred there. But tonight, every window of the condemned house blazed with that same sickly light. She rubbed her eyes, certain she must be dreaming. But when she looked again, the light remained. Pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat. Then it began to dim, fading gradually until it was gone, leaving her staring at nothing but darkness. Marlene stood frozen at the window for several minutes, waiting to see if the light would return. When it didn't, she crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin despite the fact that she wasn't cold anymore. "I must be more tired than I thought," she told herself. "Moving stress, that's all it is." But as she drifted back to sleep, her writer's mind was already turning the incident over, examining it from different angles. There was something about that light, something not quite right, something that didn't belong in this world. "Oh, you're renting the Gardner cottage?" The cafe owner, Dolores according to her name tag, seemed surprised as she set down Marlene's coffee. "Most folks around here don't like to stay out that way." "Why not?" Marlene asked, adding a splash of cream to her mug. "It's beautiful, peaceful." Dolores glanced around the nearly empty cafe, then leaned in. "Well, it's not far from the old Pearson house. Place has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Marlene tried to sound merely curious, but her pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of local color she'd hoped to find. "Bad things happened there long time ago." Dolores straightened up as the bell above the door jingled. "Talk to Jerry over at the Historical Society if you're interested. He knows all that old stuff." A gray-haired man in a flannel shirt approached the counter, nodding at Marlene before turning to Dolores. "Morning, Dole. The usual, Frank? You know it." Marlene sipped her coffee, considering whether to press Dolores for more information, when Frank glanced her way again. "You the writer lady? Renting the Gardner place?" "That's me, Marlene Collins." She extended her hand, which he shook firmly. "Frank Tanner, sheriff's deputy." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Small town. News travels fast. So I'm gathering. Just wanted to introduce myself. You need anything, you give the station a call. Cell reception's spotty out your way." "Thanks, I appreciate that." Marlene hesitated. "Actually, I was wondering about the old house up the hill from me, the Pearson place." Something flickered across Frank's weathered face. "What about it?" "I was just curious about its history. And, are there any squatters using it? I thought I saw lights there last night." Frank and Dolores exchanged a look that made the hair on Marlene's arms stand up. "No squatters," Frank said finally. "Place is falling apart. Been condemned for years. Probably just headlights from the road reflecting off the windows. But there isn't a road behind. Listen." Frank interrupted, his voice dropping. That house has a bad history. People around here, we don't go near it. You'd be smart to do the same. He took his coffee from Dolores and left without another word, the bell jangling cheerfully behind him. Marlene stared after him, then turned to Dolores, who was suddenly very busy wiping down the counter. So, Marlene said, where did you say the Historical Society was? 3. The Pinewood Hollow Historical Society was housed in an old brick building that had once been the town's first schoolhouse. Inside, it smelled of dust and old paper. Display cases lined the walls, filled with artifacts from the town's modest history. Mining tools, yellowed photographs, faded uniforms. Hello, Marlene called out. Anyone here? A door behind the reception desk opened, and a thin man with tufts of white hair sticking out at odd angles appeared. He wore thick glasses and a cardigan with elbow patches, looking every bit the stereotypical historian. Sorry about that, he said. His voice raspy but energetic, was cataloging some new donations in the back. Jerry Howell. He extended a hand over the counter. Marlene Collins. I'm new in town. Ah, the writer. Renting the Gardner place, right? Marlene laughed. Does everyone know everything about everyone here? Pretty much. Jerry grinned. Small town life. So what can I help you with? Research for a book. Actually, yes. I'm interested in the old Pearson house. The one up the hill from my rental. Jerry's smile faltered. The Pearson house. Well now, that's a dark chapter in local history. That's what I keep hearing, but no one will tell me why. Jerry motioned for her to follow him into a small research room lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. Have a seat. I'll pull what we have. While he rummaged through the files, Marlene sat at a wooden table that had clearly been used by generations of students. Initials and crude drawings were carved into its surface. Here we go, Jerry said, returning with a thick folder. The Pearson family owned the largest lumber mill in the county back in the 1920s. William Pearson built that house in 1922, lived there with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children. He laid out several photographs. One showed the house when it was new, a grand Victorian with gingerbread trim and a widow's walk. Another showed a stern-looking man with a mustache, a thin woman beside him, and 3 solemn-faced children arranged in front of the house. What happened to them? Marlene asked, studying the photographs. Jerry hesitated. In 1927, William Pearson killed his entire family and then himself, shot his wife and children in their beds, then put the gun in his mouth on the front porch. Marlene looked up, startled by the bluntness of his statement. Why? That's where things get strange. Jerry pulled out a yellowed newspaper. According to the housekeeper, who discovered the bodies, William had been acting erratically for weeks. Said he kept seeing lights in the woods at night. Became convinced something was trying to communicate with him. A chill ran through Marlene. Lights? What kind of lights? The articles don't specify. Just strange lights. But there were rumors. Jerry lowered his voice. Stories about people seeing an unearthly glow around the house in the days before the murders. Some said William had discovered something in the woods. Something that should have stayed buried. What was it? Jerry shook his head. Nobody knows for sure. The house passed to a distant relative who never lived in it. It's changed hands several times since, but no one stays long. There have been incidents. What kind of incidents? Accidents. Mental breakdowns. More than one suicide. Jerry closed the folder abruptly. Look, Miss Collins, I know you're a writer looking for a good story, but some stories are better left alone. That house has a darkness to it. Marlene thought of the light she'd seen the night before. It hadn't felt dark. It had felt alive, pulsing, searching. Has anyone ever reported seeing lights there? In recent years, Jerry's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. Why do you ask? Just curious. He studied her for a long moment. Every few years, someone reports seeing lights up there. The sheriff sends someone to check, but they never find anything. Most people in town avoid looking at the place altogether, especially at night. Marlene took out her notebook. Do you mind if I make some copies of these articles? Be my guest. But Ms. Collins. Jerry waited until she met his eyes. Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. That house isn't just empty. It's hungry. Marlene spent the afternoon setting up her recording equipment in the cottage's small second bedroom, which she'd converted into a makeshift studio. Her true crime podcast, Beneath the Surface, had a modest but devoted following, and she needed to record an introduction for her upcoming episode on the Blackwood Strangler case. But her mind kept wandering to the Pearson house and the strange light she'd seen. Was it possible she'd glimpsed the same phenomenon that had driven William Pearson to murder his family nearly a century ago? After 3 botched attempts at recording, she gave up and decided to walk up to the house. In daylight, just to satisfy her curiosity. The afternoon was overcast, the October air crisp and smelling of pine. As she hiked up the hill behind her cottage, Marlene could see why the Pearsons had chosen this spot for their home. Even now, dilapidated and forbidding, the house commanded a magnificent view of the surrounding valley and the small town below. Up close, the house was even more imposing than it appeared from a distance. 3 stories of Victorian splendor gone to seed. Most of the windows were broken, the paint peeled away to reveal gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged dangerously, and yellow police tape was stretched across the entrance. Condemned, "No trespassing" read the faded sign nailed to the door. Marlene stood at the edge of what had once been a grand lawn, now overgrown with weeds and brambles. She took out her phone and snapped a few pictures. The place was a gold mine of atmospheric B-roll for her podcast. As she circled around to the east side of the house, she noticed something odd. While most of the structure was in advanced decay, one section seemed almost preserved. A small gabled wing that might once have been a study or sitting room. Its windows were intact, the paint less faded. Curious, Marlene picked her way through the undergrowth toward this anomaly. As she drew closer, she could see that the window was not just intact but clean, as if someone had recently wiped away decades of grime. She peered inside. The room beyond was empty save for a single chair facing the window. An old wooden chair with a high back, positioned as if someone had been sitting there, looking out at her cottage below. A twig snapped behind her. Marlene whirled around, heart thundering in her chest. Frank Tanner stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn, arms crossed over his chest. "I thought I mentioned that folks around here stay away from this place. Jesus, you scared me," Marlene said, hand pressed to her chest. "That's the idea. Scare you away from here." Frank walked closer, his boots crushing the dead leaves underfoot. "This isn't a tourist attraction, Miss Collins. It's dangerous. The floors could give way, the roof could collapse." "I was just looking," Marlene said, feeling oddly defensive. "I'm researching local history for my podcast." Frank's eyes flicked to the window she'd been peering through, then back to her face. "Find what you were looking for?" "Not really. Just an empty room with a chair." Something flickered across Frank's face. Surprise? Concern? "What did you say?" "There's just an empty room with a chair in it, facing the window." Frank stepped past her and looked through the window. His posture stiffened. "What's wrong?" Marlene asked. "Nothing." Frank turned back to her, his expression carefully blank. "There's no chair in that room. There's nothing in there at all." Marlene frowned and looked again. The room was completely empty. No chair, no furniture of any kind. "But I just saw." She trailed off, a cold sensation spreading through her chest. "Your eyes playing tricks," Frank said. But the tenseness in his voice suggested he didn't believe it either. "Listen, I need you to promise me you'll stay away from here. This place isn't safe." "Is it because of what happened to the Pearsons?" Frank's jaw tightened. "It's because it's a condemned building and I don't want to have to scrape you off the floor when it collapses." He softened slightly. "Look, we get kids up here sometimes, thrill seekers, ghost hunters. They don't understand what they're messing with. I'd hate to see you get hurt because of a podcast." "I understand," Marlene said, though she didn't, not really. "I'll stay away." As they walked back down the hill together, Marlene couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was holding something back. When they reached her cottage, she turned to him. "The light I saw last night, it wasn't headlights, was it?" Frank hesitated, then sighed. "No, it wasn't." "What was it?" "I don't know. Nobody does." He glanced back up the hill. "But whatever it is, it's been here a long time, and it doesn't like being disturbed." "Has it hurt anyone?" "Not directly, but people who get too interested in it, who try to understand it or capture it somehow, they don't tend to fare well." "What does that mean?" Frank looked at her, his weathered face grim. "It means you should lock your doors tonight, Miss Collins, and maybe keep the curtains drawn." 5. Marlene didn't take Frank's advice about the curtains. Instead, she positioned a chair by her bedroom window, her camera set up on a tripod beside her. If the light appeared again, she wanted to document it. The hours ticked by. 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. The darkness outside her window remained absolute. The old Pearson house an indistinct shadow against the night sky. At 2:30 a.m., she was struggling to keep her eyes open. Maybe it had been a one-time occurrence. Or maybe she really had imagined it. Her writer's mind playing tricks on her in an unfamiliar place. She was about to give up when she saw it. A faint glow emanating from the trees near the old house. Not from the house itself this time, but from the woods beside it. Fully alert now, Marlene pressed record on her camera and watched as the glow intensified, coalescing into a ball of pulsing light that hovered among the trees. It was the same sickly greenish-white she had seen before, but now it seemed more focused, more intentional. The light began to move, weaving between the trees, descending the hill toward her cottage. Marlene's mouth went dry. This was no reflection, no trick of the light. Whatever this was, it was coming toward her. She thought about Frank's warning, about the chair she had seen that wasn't there, about William Pearson and the lights in the woods that had driven him to murder his family. I should turn off the camera, she thought. I should draw the curtains and lock the doors and forget I ever saw this. But she didn't move. She couldn't. The light held her transfixed as it drifted closer, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost familiar, like a half-remembered song. When it reached the edge of her yard, it paused, hovering about 6 feet above the ground. Pulsed once, twice, 3 times, brighter each time, as if trying to communicate. Marlene found herself raising her hand in response, mirroring the pulses by opening and closing her fist. 1, 2, 3. The light flared blindingly bright, then shot toward her window with frightening speed. Marlene scrambled backward, knocking over her chair as the light slammed against the glass. For one terrifying moment, she thought the window would shatter, but the light simply hovered there, pressed against the pane like a living thing seeking entry. Up close, she could see that it wasn't a uniform glow. Within the light were swirling patterns, complex geometries that hurt her eyes to look at directly, and deeper still, shadows that moved with purpose, as if something solid existed within the light itself. "What are you?" she whispered. The light pulsed in response, and with each pulse, Marlene felt a corresponding pressure in her head, behind her eyes. Ideas and images flashed through her mind too quickly to grasp, fragments of thoughts that weren't her own. The pressure built until she cried out, pressing her palms against her temples. "Stop it!" The light retreated a few feet from the window, still pulsing, but less intensely. Marlene's head throbbed. She felt nauseated and dizzy, but also exhilarated. Whatever this thing was, it had tried to communicate with her, and for a moment she had almost understood. She reached for her camera, which was still recording, and angled it toward the window. "I'm going to help you," she said to the light. "I'm going to understand what you want." The light flared once more, then zipped back up the hill, disappearing into the trees near the Pearson house. Marlene sat on the floor, trembling from adrenaline. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had changed everything. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a discovery. She played back the footage, but was disappointed to find that the camera had captured only a vague, blurry glow. Nothing like the complex, structured light she had seen with her own eyes. Still, it was evidence, and it was a start. As she climbed back into bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep, Marlene didn't notice the faint greenish tinge that had appeared in her own pupils, visible only in certain angles of light. 6. The next morning, Marlene woke with a splitting headache and the vague memory of disturbing dreams. In them, she had been wandering through the old Pearson house, following the light from room to room, always just out of reach. And in the final dream, she had found herself sitting in that wooden chair, staring out the window at her own cottage below, watching herself sleep. She shuddered at the memory and fumbled for her phone. It was past noon. She had slept much later than usual. As she made coffee, she replayed the footage from the night before. In the harsh light of day, the video was even less impressive. Just a blob of light that could easily be dismissed as lens flare or some other camera artifact. But she knew what she had seen, and she knew it had tried to communicate with her. Her headache intensified as she tried to recall the fragments of thought that had passed through her mind during the encounter. There had been images, a deep hole in the earth, the face of a terrified man who might have been William Pearson, the interior of the old house as it once was, full of light and life, and beneath it all, a sense of desperate longing, of being trapped, of needing something only she could provide. Marlene rubbed her temples. The more she tried to remember, the more her head hurt. She needed aspirin. As she rummaged through her toiletry bag, she caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror and froze. Her eyes. There was something wrong with her eyes. She leaned closer to the mirror. Her normally brown irises were shot through with filaments of that same greenish-white light, like tiny lightning bolts frozen in amber. "What the hell?" she whispered, touching the skin beneath her eye. The strands of light shifted as she moved, catching the bathroom light at different angles. Anyone who didn't know better might think it was just an unusual eye color. But Marlene knew differently. The light had left something of itself inside her. She should have been terrified. She should have called Frank or packed her bags and fled this place. But instead, she felt a strange calm, a certainty that this was meant to happen, that she had been chosen. It wants to communicate, she thought. It needs a vessel. The thought didn't feel like her own, but she embraced it anyway. She spent the rest of the day researching, pulling together everything she could find about the Pearson house and the surrounding area. The town records were sparse, but she found references to strange occurrences in the woods dating back to the earliest settlers. Native American legends spoke of a place in the forest where the veil between worlds was thin, where lights danced among the trees, and those who followed them never returned. By evening, her headache had subsided, replaced by a humming energy that made it impossible to sit still. She paced her small cottage, waiting impatiently for darkness to fall, certain that the light would return. At sunset, she climbed the hill to the Pearson house, ignoring Frank's warnings. She needed to be closer this time, needed to understand. The house loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. Marlene approached the east wing, where she had seen the phantom chair. The window was still clean, the room beyond still empty. No, not empty. As the last rays of sunlight faded, a faint green glow began to emanate from inside the room. Not the bright, pulsing light she had seen in the woods, but a subtle luminescence that seemed to seep from the very walls. Marlene pressed her face against the glass, trying to see where the light was coming from. As she watched, the glow intensified, concentrating in the center of the room. And then, like particles coalescing, the chair began to form again. Not solid, but defined by the light. A ghostly outline that became more substantial with each passing second. And there was someone sitting in it. A thin woman in an old-fashioned dress, her back to Marlene, facing the window. Her form was translucent, constructed of the same greenish light, but Marlene could make out the details of her hair, piled high on her head in the style of the 1920s. "Eleanor," Marlene whispered, recognizing the woman from the photographs Jerry had shown her. Eleanor Pearson, murdered by her husband in 1927. At the sound of her name, the figure turned. Marlene gasped and stumbled backward. The face that looked at her was not a human face. It had the general shape of one, but where features should be, there were only swirling patterns of light, complex geometries that hurt to look at directly. The thing wearing Eleanor Pearson's form stood up from the chair and glided toward the window. It placed a hand against the glass, mirroring where Marlene's hand had been moments before. The pressure behind Marlene's eyes returned, stronger this time. Images and thoughts flooded her mind. A crash, a tear in reality, a being of light trapped in darkness, decades of waiting, of searching for a way home. And suddenly, Marlene understood. This thing wasn't Eleanor Pearson. It wasn't human at all. It was something else, something that had been here long before the Pearson house was built. Something that had been trapped here when William Pearson broke through some barrier that should have remained intact. It had tried to communicate with William, but he hadn't understood. He had only seen the forms it took, the phantoms of his own family members walking the halls at night, sitting in chairs, watching him. It had driven him mad, but Marlene could understand. The light in her eyes, it was a connection, a bridge. Help me, the thought came, not in words but in a pure conceptual form that translated itself in Marlene's mind. Free me. How? Marlene asked aloud. The figure of Eleanor Pearson dissolved, the light reforming into a swirling vortex. Within it, Marlene could see glimpses of another place. A vast, luminous void filled with similar beings of light, moving in complex patterns that suggested a civilization far beyond human understanding. Vessel, came the thought. Need vessel to return. A vessel? Marlene repeated. You mean me? Yes. Share. Temporary. Then free. Both free. The pressure in Marlene's head intensified, and she understood that the being was asking for permission. It needed to use her, to inhabit her physical form in order to perform whatever ritual or process would allow it to return to its own dimension. It was dangerous. That much was clear from what had happened to William Pearson. But Marlene was different. She was willing. She understood. Yes, she said. I'll help you. The light surged forward, passing through the glass as if it weren't there. It engulfed Marlene, and for a moment, she was blind, deaf, senseless in a sea of burning light. When her senses returned, she was on her knees in front of the window. The light was gone, or rather, it was inside her now. She could feel it, a presence sharing her consciousness, separate but intertwined. She stood up, her movements oddly fluid, as if her body had become lighter. The world around her looked different, sharper, with traces of energy she had never noticed before, glowing lines connecting all living things. Now, the thought came from the presence inside her. We prepare. 7. Marlene didn't return to her cottage that night. Instead, guided by the presence within her, she broke into the Pearson house, forcing open a window in the back where the wood had rotted away. Inside, the house was a shell of its former grandeur. Peeling wallpaper, rotted floorboards, the detritus of a century of neglect. But through her altered vision, Marlene could see something else superimposed over the decay. The house as it had been, a ghostly overlay of polished wood and fine furnishings, as if the memory of its former state had been preserved in another dimension. The presence guided her through the house, up the grand staircase that creaked dangerously beneath her weight, to the master bedroom on the second floor. Here, the overlay was strongest. She could see the four-poster bed where Eleanor Pearson had died, the decorative ceiling roses, the heavy drapes. Here, the presence communicated. This is where the tear occurred. Marlene could see it now, a distortion in the air near the center of the room, like heat waves rising from pavement, a place where reality itself had been damaged. What happened here? She asked aloud. Images flowed into her mind. William Pearson, experimenting with old books of occult knowledge he had found in the lumber mill, unknowingly performing a ritual that tore the veil between dimensions. The being of light, curious, exploratory, slipping through the tear into this world. The tear closing behind it, trapping it here. Its attempts to communicate had been misinterpreted as hauntings, as threats. William, driven mad by what he didn't understand, had killed his family and himself. But the being remained, trapped, studying humans, learning to manipulate light and form, trying to find someone who could help it return home. And that's me, Marlene said. I'm going to help you go home. Yes, but first prepare. Under the being's guidance, Marlene began to clear the debris from the center of the room, creating a space directly beneath the distortion. The being directed her to draw symbols on the floor using a piece of charcoal she found in the ancient fireplace. Complex geometries that made her head swim when she looked at them directly. As she worked, she became aware of another presence in the house. Not like the being of light, but something darker, heavier. A malevolence that seemed to seep from the very walls. "What is that?" she asked, pausing in her work. "Residue. Trauma. Death leaves a mark. Is it dangerous?" "Not to us." "Continue." But Marlene wasn't so sure. As she completed the final symbol, she felt the dark presence growing stronger, more focused. It was aware of her, of what she was doing. "We must hurry," the being urged. "The alignment is coming." Marlene understood that it was referring to some cosmic alignment that would allow the tear to be reopened. She could feel it coming too, a tension in the air, a humming that vibrated in her bones. She positioned herself in the center of the symbols, directly beneath the distortion. The being's consciousness expanded within her, pushing against the boundaries of her mind. The pressure behind her eyes built until she thought her head would explode. The alignment was close now. Marlene could see the distortion widening, the reality around it bending like plastic under heat. The symbols she had drawn began to glow with the same greenish-white light that now poured from her eyes, her mouth, every pore of her skin. And then, abruptly, the light withdrew, contracting back into her body. The symbols faded. The distortion stabilized. "Something blocks us," the being communicated, its thoughts tinged with what Marlene interpreted as frustration. "The dark presence. It does not want me to leave." "Why not?" Marlene asked, her voice hoarse. "It feeds on me, on my energy. It has been feeding for almost a century." Marlene understood then. The malevolence in the house, it wasn't just residual trauma from the murders. It was something else, something that had been attracted by the tear in reality. Something that had found a rich source of energy in the trapped being of light. And it did not want to lose its food source. As if in response to her realization, the temperature in the room plummeted. The floorboards groaned as if under immense pressure. The walls seemed to contract, closing in around her. "We must leave," the being urged. "Regroup. Find another way." Marlene didn't need to be told twice. She fled the room, stumbling down the rotting staircase, feeling the malevolent presence pursuing her, reaching for her with cold, intangible hands. She burst out the front door onto the sagging porch, not stopping until she reached the overgrown lawn. Only then did she turn back to look at the house. Every window was dark, but in one, the master bedroom where she had drawn the symbols, she could see a face pressed against the glass. Not Eleanor Pearson this time, but William. His features were contorted with rage, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Not him," the being communicated. "It wears his face, as I wear yours." "What is it?" Marlene whispered. "Parasite, a devourer. In your language, the closest concept would be a demon." The face in the window disappeared, but Marlene could still feel the malevolent presence watching her, waiting. It wasn't done with her, or with the being of light she harbored. "Cannot leave the house," the being reassured her. "The trauma binds it there. But we need to go back if we're going to reopen the tear," Marlene said. "Yes, but not tonight. Tonight we prepare properly." Marlene returned to her cottage as dawn broke, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The presence within her had retreated somewhat, giving her space to think, to process what was happening. She should have been terrified. She should have been trying to expel this alien consciousness from her mind. But instead, she felt a strange exhilaration. This was beyond anything she could have imagined, proof of other dimensions, of beings beyond human understanding. And she was at the center of it all. She made coffee with shaking hands and sat at her small kitchen table, trying to form a plan. The being had shared glimpses of what needed to be done, a ritual that would harness the energy of the next alignment to reopen the tear just long enough for it to slip through. But the malevolent entity in the house would try to stop them. "Why can't it just let you go?" she asked aloud. "There must be other sources of energy." Not like me, the being responded. I am unique here. My energy is compatible with its needs in a way nothing else in this dimension is. So it's been feeding on you for almost 100 years? How are you still alive? My kind does not die as yours does, but I am diminished, weakened. Each feeding takes more of my essence. If I remain much longer, I will fade entirely. Marlene felt a pang of sympathy for the being, trapped in an alien dimension, slowly being consumed by a predator it couldn't escape. I'll help you, she promised. We'll get you home. She spent the day researching, trying to find any information that might help them counter the malevolent entity. The being assisted, directing her to obscure websites and forgotten forums where occult knowledge was shared. By evening, they had formulated a plan. They would need to cleanse the house, weaken the entity's hold on it. Then, during the next alignment, which would occur at exactly 3:17 a.m. the following night, they would attempt the ritual again. Marlene was making final notes when there was a knock at her door. Through the window, she could see Frank Tanner's patrol car parked in her driveway. She hesitated. The being within her retreated further, hiding itself in the recesses of her mind. Careful, it cautioned. He suspects. Let me handle this, Marlene muttered, and went to answer the door. Frank stood on her porch, his weathered face grim. Evening, Ms. Collins. Mind if I come in? Actually, I was just about to. It'll only take a minute. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Marlene stepped aside reluctantly. Frank entered, his eyes scanning her living room, taking in the scattered papers covered in strange symbols, the open laptop displaying an occult website. Doing some research? He asked mildly. For my podcast. Marlene closed the laptop. What can I help you with, Deputy? Frank turned to face her directly. I drove by the Pearson place this morning. Noticed some fresh footprints leading up to it. Broken window in the back. Marlene's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. Really? Kids, maybe? You mentioned thrill seekers. Maybe. Frank studied her face. Except they looked like they were made by women's hiking boots. Size 7, I'd guess. About your size. That's a common size. Sure is. Frank picked up one of her papers, examining the symbols she had copied from memory. This looks like the same kind of stuff they found in William Pearson's journal. After the murders, Marlene froze. You've seen his journal? Town keeps it locked up. Not something we like to advertise. Frank set the paper down. Ms. Collins, Marlene, I need you to listen carefully. Whatever you think is happening, whatever you think you found up there, it's not what you believe. I don't know what you mean, Marlene said, but the lie sounded weak even to her own ears. I think you do. Frank's voice softened. You've seen the light, and now it's talking to you, isn't it? Showing you things, making you promises. The presence in Marlene's mind stirred uneasily. He knows too much. Dangerous. It's not what you think, Marlene said, unsure whether she was addressing Frank or the being. It's exactly what I think. Frank sat down on her couch, suddenly looking tired. My grandmother saw the lights when she was a girl. She told me about them, said they were beautiful, said they spoke to her, showed her things no human was meant to see. What happened to her? Marlene asked, though she feared she already knew. She went up to that house one night. To help them, she said. To send them home. Frank looked up, his eyes locking with hers. They found her body 3 days later in the woods. The official report said she fell, hit her head. But my grandfather always said she looked emptied out, like something had hollowed her from the inside. The being's unease grew stronger, pressing against Marlene's consciousness. He lies, trying to frighten you. We must proceed. But Marlene wasn't so sure anymore. Frank, what if it's telling the truth? What if it just wants to go home? That's how it works. It finds people who'll listen. People with imagination, with empathy. It shows them just enough truth to gain their trust. Frank stood up. But it's not trying to go home, Marlene. It's trying to bring others here. The presence flared in her mind. Angry now. Lies. We must silence him. No! Marlene gasped. pressing her hands to her temples. Frank stepped forward, alarmed. "Marlene? Are you all right?" She looked up at him and Frank recoiled. She knew he could see it now. The light in her eyes, the alien presence looking out through her human pupils. "Jesus," he whispered. "It's already in you. It's not what you think," Marlene insisted, fighting for control. "It's trapped here. It just wants to go home. That's what it wants you to believe." Frank reached for his gun, then thought better of it. "Marlene, listen to me. There's still time. You can fight this. Don't let it use you. He fears us," the being hissed in her mind. "He knows we are close to freedom. Stop him. Get out," Marlene said, unsure if the words were her own or the being's. "Get out now." Frank backed toward the door, hands raised placatingly. "I'm going. But Marlene, please don't go back to that house. And if you start to feel like you're losing yourself, like you're not in control anymore, call me. Day or night. I can help." After he left, Marlene collapsed onto the couch, trembling. The being's anger receded slowly, replaced by what felt like calculation. "He will try to stop us. What if he's right?" Marlene asked. "What if you're not telling me everything? Would I share consciousness with you if I meant harm? Would I make myself so vulnerable?" It was a reasonable point. The being had exposed itself completely to her. She could feel its desperation, its longing for home. "We must act tonight," it insisted, "before he returns with others." Marlene hesitated. Then, making her decision, she stood up and began gathering what they would need for the ritual. 9. Night fell over Pinewood Hollow, bringing with it a sky full of stars and a waning moon that cast just enough light for Marlene to find her way up the hill to the Pearson house. She carried a backpack filled with the items they had determined might help weaken the malevolent entity. Salt, sage, candles inscribed with the symbols the being had shown her. As she approached the house, she could feel the weight of its malevolence pressing down on her, a tangible force that made each step more difficult than the last. "It knows we are coming," the being communicated. "Prepares. Can it hurt us?" Marlene asked, pausing at the edge of the overgrown lawn. "Not you. Me, yes. You it would use as it used William Pearson." "Comforting," Marlene muttered, but continued forward. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, the house was pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight beam. To the room, Marlene made her way carefully up the rotting staircase, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the occasional creak of settling wood. When she reached the master bedroom, she found the symbols she had drawn still visible on the dusty floor. She set down her backpack and began preparations for the cleansing ritual, laying out the salt in a circle around the symbols, placing candles at specific points. As she worked, she became aware of whispers at the edge of her hearing, too faint to make out words, but carrying tones of pleading, of warning. "Do you hear that?" she asked the being. "Echoes. Residual energy. Ignore." But the whispers grew louder as she completed the circle, gradually resolving into distinct voices. A woman's desperate plea, children crying, a man repeating, I'm sorry," over and over. The Pearsons, or at least the psychic imprints they had left behind. Almost time, the being urged, "Light the candles." Marlene's hands shook as she struck a match. The whispers reached a fevered pitch as each candle flared to life, illuminating the room in flickering orange light that cast monstrous shadows on the peeling walls. As the final candle was lit, the whispers cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, heavy with menace. Marlene stepped into the center of the salt circle, positioning herself beneath the distortion in reality that only she could see. The being surged forward in her mind, taking more control than before. She could feel it gathering its strength, preparing for what was to come. "What now?" she asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "We cleanse. We weaken it. Then we wait for the alignment." The being began to recite words through her mouth. Not English, not any human language, but something far older. The sound vibrated in her chest, resonated in her bones. With each phrase, the salt circle glowed brighter. The candle flames stretched higher. The house responded with creaks and groans, the walls seeming to contract around her. The temperature plummeted until her breath fogged in front of her face. And then she saw it. A darkness deeper than the shadows, seeping from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It pooled like liquid night at the edges of the salt circle, testing its boundaries, searching for a way in. The being's recitation grew more urgent, the words flowing faster from Marlene's lips. The light within her, the being's essence, began to pour out through her eyes, her mouth, her fingertips, meeting the darkness at the edge of the circle, pushing it back. The battle raged around her, light against dark, neither gaining the upper hand. Marlene could feel herself weakening, the being drawing on her life force to fuel its struggle. Her vision blurred, her knees threatened to buckle. Hold on, the being urged. Almost done. The darkness retreated inch by inch, forced back into the walls. The house gave a final, tremendous groan, like a creature in pain, and then fell silent. Marlene collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The being withdrew slightly, giving her back control of her body. "We have weakened it," the being communicated, its thoughts tinged with satisfaction. "Now we wait." According to the being, the alignment would occur at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time Marlene had first seen the light in the Pearson house. It was just after midnight now. They had more than 3 hours to wait. "I need to rest," Marlene said aloud, her voice hoarse from the being's recitation. "Yes, rest. I will watch." Marlene lay down on the dusty floor within the salt circle, using her backpack as a pillow. Despite the hard floor and the lingering chill in the air, exhaustion overtook her quickly. She slipped into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with swirling lights and reaching shadows. She woke to the being's urgent prodding in her mind. "Wake up. He comes." Marlene sat up, disoriented. Her watch showed 2:45 a.m. The alignment was still half an hour away. "Who's coming?" she asked. But even as the words left her mouth, she heard the creak of the front door opening below. "The deputy. He brings others." Marlene scrambled to her feet, listening intently. She could hear footsteps, multiple sets, and voices murmuring downstairs. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We proceed. The circle will protect us until the alignment." But Marlene wasn't so sure. The being had been wrong before. It hadn't anticipated the strength of the malevolent entity. What if it was wrong about this too? The footsteps were on the stairs now. Flashlight beams swept beneath the door to the master bedroom. "Trust me," the being urged. "We are so close." The door swung open. Frank stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men Marlene didn't recognize. One held a large leather-bound book. "Marlene," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. "Step out of the circle." "You don't understand," Marlene said. "It just wants to go home. It's trapped here." "That's what it told my grandmother too." Frank stepped into the room, careful to stay clear of the salt circle. "That's what it's told everyone it's tried to use." "He lies. The alignment comes. We must complete the ritual." "I know what you are," Frank said. But he wasn't looking at Marlene now. He was looking through her at the presence within. "We've kept your kind out of our world for generations. This ends tonight." The man with the book, older, with white hair and a lined face, began to read from it. The words were in Latin, flowing with practiced ease from his lips. The being within Marlene recoiled, pain spiking through her head. She cried out, dropping to her knees. "Stop them," the being pleaded. "They will destroy me." "Frank, please." Marlene gasped through the pain. "You're hurting it." "That's the idea." Frank's expression was grim but determined. "I'm sorry, Marlene. This is going to get worse before it gets better." The older man continued reading, and with each phrase, the being's agony intensified, bleeding over into Marlene's consciousness. She writhed on the floor, feeling as if her very atoms were being torn apart. And then, abruptly, the pain stopped. The being surged forward, taking control of Marlene's body with a force that left her consciousness pushed to the side, a passenger in her own flesh. Enough! The voice that came from her mouth was not her own, deeper, resonant with power. Marlene's body rose to its feet, her eyes now blazing with green-white light. "You know nothing of what you oppose, human," the older man faltered in his reading, clearly shaken by the transformation before him. Frank stepped in front of him protectively. "Let her go," Frank demanded. "Whatever you're promising her, it's a lie." Marlene's body laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Lies? You speak of lies? You who hide the truth from your people, who bury the knowledge of what exists beyond your small world." "I know enough," Frank said steadily. "I know you need a human host to perform your ritual. I know you've tried before, with William Pearson, with my grandmother, with others through the years. And I know that when you're done, there's nothing left of them." Within her own mind, Marlene struggled to regain control. The being had never taken over so completely before. She could feel its desperation, its rage, but also something else. A hunger that matched the malevolent entities, just better hidden. "What are you really doing?" She thought at it. "Tell me the truth." Its attention split between her and the men before it. The being's control slipped just enough for her to catch glimpses of its true intentions. Not a return home, but a widening of the tear, an opening of a permanent gateway between dimensions. Not for one being to escape, but for many to enter. And she, Marlene, would be the sacrifice that powered it all. With a tremendous effort of will, Marlene clawed her way back to partial control. "Frank," she gasped, her voice her own again for a moment. "Help me." The older man resumed reading immediately, his voice stronger now. The third man stepped forward, opening a container of salt, reinforcing the circle. The being howled in Marlene's mind, fighting to regain control. The light poured from her eyes, her mouth, seeking escape. "You betrayed me," it raged. "We could have been glorious. You lied to me," Marlene whispered. "You were never trapped. You were scouting, preparing the way." The house began to shake around them, dust and bits of plaster raining from the ceiling. The malevolent entity, sensing the being's weakness, re-emerged from the walls, darkness flowing toward the circle. "It's coming!" the third man shouted, backing away from the encroaching shadows. "Keep reading," Frank ordered the older man, then turned to Marlene. "Fight it, Marlene. Push it out." Marlene's body convulsed as the battle raged within her. The being fighting to maintain its hold, Marlene struggling to expel it. She could feel it burning through her, using her life energy as fuel in its desperate attempt to complete the ritual before the exorcism took full effect. The alignment was approaching. Marlene could feel it, a building tension in the air, a humming in her bones. The distortion above her head widened incrementally, reality thinning. "It's working!" the older man cried, seeing the light begin to separate from Marlene's body, forming a swirling vortex above her. But the darkness was inside the circle now, rising like smoke around Marlene. The malevolent entity had found its opening. The being's weakened state had created a breach in their defenses. Marlene felt cold tendrils wrapping around her legs, her waist, her throat. The entity wasn't trying to possess her as the being of light had. It was trying to drag her into the house itself, to consume her completely. The being of light, seeing its host threatened, made a final, desperate move. It poured its remaining energy into Marlene, not to control her, but to strengthen her against the darkness. "Fight it," the being urged. "I cannot complete the ritual without you." In that moment of clarity, Marlene saw the truth. The being of light and the malevolent entity, they weren't enemies. They were two parts of a whole separated long ago. The light needed the dark to fully open the gateway, and the dark needed the light to guide others through. They had been working together all along, playing their parts in an elaborate performance designed to manipulate her, and others before her, into becoming willing sacrifices. "Frank!" she screamed over the cacophony of the shaking house. "Both of them, they're working together." Frank's eyes widened in understanding. He grabbed the book from the older man and flipped frantically through the pages, searching for something. Marlene was sinking into the floor, the darkness pulling her down. The light pulsed above her, stretching toward the widening distortion in reality. The alignment was seconds away. Frank found the page he was looking for and began to read. A different incantation, older and more powerful. As the words filled the room, both the darkness and the light recoiled, their hold on Marlene weakening. With her last reserves of strength, Marlene reached up and grabbed the swirling vortex of light, even as the darkness tried to drag her down. The contact burned like acid, but she held on, channeling the dark entity's energy into the light, creating a feedback loop between the two. The being's carefully constructed deception collapsed as they were forced back together, light and dark merging into a churning mass of energy. The distortion in reality began to close, drawing the combined entity toward it like a black hole. "Get out!" Frank shouted, grabbing Marlene's arm, pulling her from the grasp of the fading darkness. "The house is coming down." The four of them ran, stumbling down the rotting staircase as the house shook itself apart around them. Behind them, the master bedroom imploded, the tear in reality sealing itself with a thunderous clap that shook the entire structure. They burst through the front door seconds before the house collapsed in on itself, the ancient timbers groaning one final time as they fell. Dust billowed out into the night air, engulfing them as they crouched on what had once been the front lawn. When the dust settled and the night was quiet once more, there was nothing left of the Pearson house but a pile of broken wood and shattered glass. And in the sky above where it had stood, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if a veil had been lifted. 3 months later, Marlene sat across from Frank at Dolores's cafe, nursing a cup of coffee. The physical scars from that night had healed, the burns on her hands, the cuts and bruises from their frantic escape. The psychological scars would take longer. "How's the book coming?" Frank asked. After the incident, Marlene had abandoned her podcast in favor of writing a fictional novel based on her experience. Some truths were too strange, too dangerous to present as fact. "Almost done with the first draft," she said. "My editor thinks it'll do well." "What are you calling it?" "The Borrowed Light." Marlene smiled faintly. "Seemed fitting." Frank nodded. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe flowing around them. "Any aftereffects?" he asked quietly. Marlene hesitated. She hadn't told Frank everything. How sometimes, in her dreams, she could still feel the presence of the light. How occasionally, when she looked in the mirror first thing in the morning, she thought she caught a glimpse of green in her brown eyes. How there were moments when she knew things she shouldn't know, saw things others couldn't see. "Nothing significant," she lied. "You?" Frank shrugged. "The town feels lighter somehow, like a weight's been lifted. Jerry at the Historical Society says it's the first time in nearly a century there haven't been any reports of strange lights in the hills." "That's good." Marlene took a sip of her coffee. "I've been meaning to ask, how did you know? About the beings working together, I mean, I didn't, not for sure, but something my grandmother said always stuck with me. Before she died, she said she realized too late that the light and the shadow in that house weren't fighting each other. They were dancing." Frank's weathered face was solemn. "When you called out to me that night, it confirmed what I'd suspected all along." Marlene nodded. She still struggled to understand everything that had happened, the true nature of the entities they had encountered. Were they really from another dimension? Ancient beings that had found a way to feed on human fear and sacrifice? Or something even more alien beyond human comprehension? "Do you think they're really gone?" she asked. Frank looked down at his coffee. "I don't know. That kind of evil, that kind of hunger, it finds a way. But at least they're not here, not now." Later, as Marlene drove back to her cottage, she had decided to stay in Pinewood Hollow after all. She glanced up at the hill where the Pearson house had stood. The ruins had been cleared away months ago, leaving nothing but bare earth that was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. As dusk fell, she thought she saw a faint shimmer in the air above the empty site. A momentary distortion, there and gone in an instant. She blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light. Just her imagination. But that night, as she worked on her novel, she found herself drawn to the window again, watching the empty hilltop until well past midnight. Waiting. For what? She wasn't entirely sure. And deep within her, in a place she rarely acknowledged even to herself, there was a part of her that missed it. The connection to something vast and ancient and utterly alien. The glimpse of a reality beyond human understanding. The borrowed light that had, however briefly, made her more than what she was. As she finally turned away from the window and prepared for bed, Marlene whispered a quiet prayer that the seal between worlds would hold. Because if it didn't, if those beings found another tier, another willing vessel, there would be no stopping what came through. And because, God help her, there was a small, traitorous part of her that would welcome it. The end. The whispers of Millhaven. Millhaven, Maine had always been a quiet place, settled in the shadow of the White Mountains where the winters were harsh and unforgiving. But for the first time in 23 years, Ethan Caldwell was returning home, and something about the town felt different. Wrong. He drove his Subaru down Main Street, past Dobson's Hardware, still there, past the shuttered library, closed now, and finally past the welcome sign at the edge of town that proudly proclaimed, Millhaven, Po P 2312. Ethan knew that number had to be out of date. People had been leaving Millhaven for decades. As he pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, Ethan sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the two-story colonial that now belonged to him. His father's final heart attack had been unexpected, or so the lawyer had said when he called, but not entirely surprising given Earl Caldwell's lifestyle. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the odd timing. Just days after receiving that rambling, paranoid letter from his father. Don't come back, Ethan. Whatever you do, don't come back here. The voices are getting louder. They're in the walls now. They know things. Ethan had dismissed it as the delusions of a lonely old alcoholic. Now, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn, he wasn't so sure. The house smelled of dust and something else. Something vaguely medicinal that reminded Ethan of his mother's final days in hospice. He flicked on lights as he moved through the first floor, noting the surprising orderliness. His father had never been a tidy man, but everything was meticulously arranged, almost obsessively so. Books aligned with military precision on the shelves. Dishes stacked with perfect symmetry in the cabinets. In the living room, Ethan found the first sign that something was truly off. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, all seemingly about missing persons cases stretching back decades. Red yarn connected some articles to others, and his father's cramped handwriting filled the margins. Dates, times, locations. Jesus, Daddy, Ethan Visperet. What the hell were you doing? As if in answer, something creaked overhead, a footstep on the second floor. Ethan froze. The house should be empty. Hello? He called, his voice sounding thin and uncertain. No response, just another creak, this one from a different part of the upstairs hallway. Ethan grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel and slowly climbed the stairs, each step releasing a familiar groan from his childhood. Second step from the top, the one that always gave you away when you were trying to sneak out. His father used to say he kept it that way on purpose. The upstairs hallway was dark. Ethan fumbled for the light switch, but when he flicked it, nothing happened. Bulb must be burned out. He pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam down the corridor. Empty. The door to his father's bedroom was ajar, and Ethan approached cautiously. Is someone there? He pushed the door open wider with the candlestick. The bedroom was in stark contrast to the orderly downstairs. The mattress had been dragged off the bed and propped against the wall. The dresser drawers were pulled out, clothes spilling onto the floor. And the walls were covered with writing. Not newspaper clippings this time, but his father's own handwriting, scrawled directly onto the wallpaper in what looked like black marker. They whisper from the walls. They want something. They're hungry. They know your name. The same message over and over, covering nearly every inch of wall space. Ethan stepped further into the room, his breathing shallow. The smell was stronger here, that medicinal scent, but underneath it something else. Something rotten. His flashlight beam caught movement in the corner, and Ethan whipped around, the candlestick raised. Nothing. Just the curtains stirring in the draft from the slightly open window. But as he lowered the makeshift weapon, he heard it. A whisper, so faint it might have been imagination. Ethan, just once. His name, breathed rather than spoken, from somewhere within the walls. Your dad was losing it toward the end. Sheriff Marion what's told him the next morning over coffee at the Millhaven diner. Marion had been a few years ahead of Ethan in school, and the years hadn't been kind to her. Deep lines bracketed her mouth, and her once bright red hair was now mostly gray, pulled back in a severe ponytail. We had to bring him in twice for disturbing the peace. Found him digging in the old cemetery past midnight. Said he was looking for something. He never mentioned any of this when we talked on the phone, Ethan said, staring into his mug. He'd spent a restless night in a motel on the edge of town, unable to sleep in the house after what he'd experienced. But he sent me a letter a week ago that was concerning. Marion's eyes sharpened. What did it say? Mostly nonsense. About voices in the walls. Told me not to come back to Millhaven. The sheriff's coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. Those exact words. Voices in the walls. Something in her tone made Ethan look up. Yeah. Why? Marion set down her mug and glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning forward. Because your dad isn't the first person to talk about hearing whispers from the walls in this town. Ethan felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. What are you talking about? I probably shouldn't be telling you this, she said, lowering her voice. But there's been a pattern over the past few years. Started with older folks mostly, complaints about hearing voices from inside their homes. We chalked it up to dementia, hearing aids malfunctioning, that sort of thing. But then younger people started reporting it too. And then, she trailed off. And then what? Marion ran a hand over her face. She suddenly looked exhausted. And then some of them started to disappear. Ethan spent the rest of the morning at the town library, which, contrary to appearances, was not permanently closed, just severely understaffed. The sole librarian, a middle-aged woman named Louise who remembered Ethan from his high school days, seemed relieved to have someone to talk to. Your father was in here almost every day for the past 6 months, she told him as she led him to the local history section, researching the town's founding, old maps, geological surveys. Said he was writing a book. Ethan doubted that. His father had barely graduated high school and had never shown any literary inclinations. Did he ever mention hearing voices? Ethan asked carefully. Louise's smile faltered. Not to me, but he was interested in the old silver mine. Kept asking if we had records about the collapse of 1894. She pulled a large, dusty tome from a bottom shelf. The cover read Millhaven, A Comprehensive History, Volume 2, 1850 to 1900. This has a chapter on the mine disaster, she said, placing it on a nearby table. Happened about 5 miles outside of town. 37 men died when the main shaft collapsed. Ethan thanked her and spent the next hour reading about the disaster. Apparently, the miners had dug too deep, ignoring safety warnings in their quest for a particularly rich vein of silver. The book contained grainy black and white photographs of grim-faced rescue workers and grieving families, but little technical information about the mine itself. What caught his attention was a small paragraph near the end of the chapter. Some of the survivors reported hearing strange voices emanating from the deepest parts of the mine in the days leading up to the collapse. These accounts were dismissed as superstition or the effects of poor ventilation causing hallucinations among the miners. Ethan stared at the passage for a long time, a chill running down his spine. That afternoon, he forced himself to return to his father's house. The place looked less ominous in the daylight, just a neglected colonial in need of a fresh coat of paint. Inside, Ethan methodically began going through his father's papers, looking for anything that might explain his descent into paranoia. In the kitchen drawer, underneath a stack of takeout menus, he found a small leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated 8 months ago. October 12th. Heard it again last night. Like someone whispering my name from inside the wall behind my bed. Checked for mice. Nothing. October 17th. The whispers are getting clearer. Sometimes it's my name. Sometimes it's just help us. I think I'm losing my mind. October 23rd. Ran into Margaret at the store today. She heard them too. Said they've been keeping her up at night. Maybe I'm not crazy. The entries continued, becoming increasingly frantic and disjointed over time. Ethan's father had apparently started researching the town's history, fixating on the mine collapse. He'd tracked down surviving relatives of the miners, many still living in Millhaven. According to the journal, several elderly residents had reported hearing voices in their homes as well. The most recent entry, dated just 3 days before his father's death, sent a chill through Ethan. April 2nd, I found it. God help me, I found it. The old mine entrance. It's not sealed like everyone thinks. They're down there. They've always been down there. And now they're finding ways out. Tucked into the back of the journal was a crudely drawn map, showing a trail leading from the north end of town into the dense woods that covered the foothills. An X marked what Ethan assumed was the mine entrance. He checked his watch. 4 hours of daylight left. Enough time to find the location and be back before dark. The trail was overgrown but still visible, winding through ancient pines and over lichen-covered rocks. Ethan followed his father's map, swatting at mosquitoes and checking his phone periodically, though the signal had disappeared shortly after he entered the woods. After almost an hour of hiking, the trail dipped down into a small, secluded valley. And there it was, a dark opening in the rocky hillside, partially hidden by scrub brush and fallen trees. A wooden sign, so weathered it was barely legible, warned, "Danger, do not enter." Ethan approached cautiously. The opening was larger than he expected, easily tall enough to walk through upright. There was no gate, no fence, nothing to prevent someone from walking straight in. "This can't be right," he muttered to himself. A disaster site that had claimed nearly 40 lives should have been sealed off properly. A cool breeze emanated from the dark entrance, carrying with it a strange, metallic smell that reminded Ethan of blood. He flicked on his flashlight and directed the beam into the darkness. The tunnel extended maybe 20 feet before taking a sharp turn, preventing him from seeing further. Ethan knew he should turn back. Exploring an abandoned mine alone was beyond foolish, but something compelled him forward, the need to understand what had driven his father to madness. 10 feet into the tunnel, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls were supported by ancient timber beams, many visibly rotting. The floor was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. Ethan's flashlight beam caught something reflective ahead, a small metal object half buried in the dirt. He knelt down and carefully extracted it. A pocket watch, ancient and tarnished, but when he pressed the catch, it sprang open. The hands were frozen at 10:14, and inscribed inside the cover were the words, "To Joseph with love." 1893. One of the miners, perhaps. That's when he heard it, the whisper. His name spoken softly, from somewhere deeper in the mine. Ethan. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. "Hello? Is someone there? Ethan, help us." The voice, or voices, it was hard to tell, seemed to be coming from beyond the bend in the tunnel. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Ethan moved toward it, rounding the corner. The tunnel continued for another 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber. His flashlight couldn't penetrate the full depth of the darkness ahead, but it did reveal something unsettling, fresh footprints in the dirt, leading into the chamber. Someone had been here recently. "Come closer, Ethan. We've been waiting for you." The voice was clearer now, and unmistakably coming from somewhere in that chamber. But there was something wrong with it. A strange, harmonious quality, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. Ethan took one step forward, then another. The beam of his flashlight finally reached the far wall of the chamber, and that's when he saw them. People, dozens of them, embedded in the rock face. Not corpses, not skeletons, but somehow part of the very stone itself. Men in 19th century mining clothes, women in old-fashioned dresses, and others in more modern attire. Their faces and upper bodies protruded from the rock as if they were swimming through it, frozen in various expressions of agony or supplication. Their eyes, all of their eyes, were open and watching him. Among them, near the bottom of this grotesque tableau, was his father's face, the features contorted in a silent scream. Ethan's flashlight clattered to the ground as shock and horror overwhelmed him. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape, falling hard onto the dirt floor. The chamber was now illuminated only by the flashlight's beam reflecting off the ceiling, casting everything in dim, disorienting shadows. But Ethan could still make out movement. The faces in the wall were changing, their mouths beginning to move in unison. "Join us, Ethan. We need you. The hunger needs to be fed." And then, impossibly, the rock around them started to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. Hands, some skeletal, some fleshy, all partially formed from the living rock, began to extend outward, reaching for him. Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran, abandoning his flashlight in his panic. He crashed through the tunnel in near darkness, scraping against walls, stumbling over uneven ground. Behind him, he could hear a strange rushing sound, like sand pouring through an hourglass, but magnified 100-fold. He burst out of the mine entrance and kept running, not daring to look back until he had put several hundred yards between himself and that accursed opening in the earth. When he finally turned, gasping for breath, he saw no pursuit, just the silent, innocuous-looking entrance, a dark spot against the hillside. But as he watched, a thin, dark liquid began to seep from the mine opening, flowing out onto the ground like molasses. Where it touched the vegetation, plants withered and died instantly. Ethan didn't wait to see more. He ran all the way back to town. "You want me to go back up there? Now?" Sheriff Watts looked at Ethan like he had sprouted a second head. Night had fallen, and they were standing in the parking lot of the sheriff's office. "I know how it sounds," Ethan said desperately, "but I'm telling you what I saw. My father is somehow in the wall of that mine, and others too. People from town who've gone missing." Marion sighed heavily. "Ethan, you've had a shock. Finding your dad's conspiracy theory stuff and then going up to that old mine alone, which, by the way, is trespassing on private property. It's no wonder you imagined something scary." "I didn't imagine it," Ethan nearly shouted. "And that mine is supposed to be sealed. Why isn't it sealed?" A strange expression crossed Marion's face. "What are you talking about? That mine was sealed with concrete back in the 1920s. "No, it wasn't. I was just there. The entrance is wide open." She stared at him for a long moment. "That's not possible." "I'll show you," Ethan insisted. "Come with me right now and I'll prove it." Marion hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, let me get my gear." They took her patrol SUV, bouncing along the rutted fire road that ran closer to the mine than the hiking trail Ethan had used earlier. Marion drove in tense silence, occasionally giving him sideways glances that made it clear she thought he was either lying or having some kind of breakdown. When they reached the trailhead, she grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and her service weapon before leading the way into the woods. They hiked for 20 minutes, guided by the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "It should be right ahead," Ethan said as they descended into the small valley. "Just past those." He stopped abruptly. Where the mine entrance had been just hours before, there was now only a solid rock face, partially obscured by vegetation. That's not possible," Ethan stammered, rushing forward to the spot where he was certain the entrance had been. He began pulling away branches and brush, revealing only solid stone underneath. "It was here. I swear to God it was right here." Marion trained her flashlight on the area. "Ethan, there's no mine entrance here. Hasn't been for 100 years." No, Ethan muttered, now scrabbling at the rock face with his bare hands. His fingers found a small crevice, and for a moment hope surged, but it was just a natural fissure in the stone, not nearly large enough for a person to pass through. As his fingers traced the crack, he felt something move on the other side. a subtle shifting like something pressing back against his touch. And then he heard it again, that harmonious whisper, seemingly emanating from the solid rock. Soon, Ethan. Not yet, but soon. He jerked his hand away as if burned. Did you hear that? Marion looked increasingly concerned. Hear what? The voices. They're in the rock. The sheriff sighed and holstered her weapon. Ethan, I think we need to get you checked out at the hospital. You've been through a lot, and grief can do strange things to a person's mind. I'm not making this up, Ethan insisted, but even as he said it, doubt began to creep in. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he breaking down just like his father? No. The pocket watch, he still had the pocket watch he'd found in the mine. He patted his pockets frantically. Empty. The next morning, after a restless night at the motel, Marion had insisted he not stay alone in his father's house. Ethan returned to the library. Louise greeted him with a sympathetic smile. Sheriff, what's told me what happened, she said quietly. I'm so sorry about your father. Ethan gave a non-committal nod, not wanting to discuss his apparent hallucination episode from the night before. I need to see any records you have about people who've gone missing in Millhaven over the past few years. Louise hesitated. That's not really something we keep here. The sheriff's office would. Please, Ethan interrupted. I know my father was tracking disappearances. I just need to verify some things. Perhaps taking pity on him. Louise led him to a computer. We keep digital archives of the local paper going back about 15 years. That might help. Ethan spent the next several hours methodically searching through news reports. What he found disturbed him deeply. Over the past 5 years, 12 people had been reported missing in and around Millhaven, a staggeringly high number for a town of this size. Most were explained away as probable runaways, hikers lost in the mountains, or elderly residents with dementia who had wandered off. But one detail connected several cases. Family members reporting that before disappearing, the missing persons had complained about hearing whispers or voices, often coming from the walls of their homes. Even more disturbing were the faces themselves. Ethan recognized several of them from his vision in the mine, the faces embedded in the rock wall. He hadn't imagined it. Somehow, those missing people were trapped in the mine. As he stared at the face of a young woman who had disappeared just 3 months ago, he felt a vibration in his pocket. His phone was buzzing with an incoming call from an unknown number. Hello? He answered cautiously. Mr. Caldwell? The voice was unfamiliar, female, elderly. This is Margaret Holloway. I was a friend of your father's. The name triggered a memory. Ran into Margaret at the store today. She heard them too, from his father's journal. Mrs. Holloway, how did you get my number? That's not important right now, she replied, her voice tense. What's important is that you need to leave Millhaven. Today. Now. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Why? Because they know you've seen them. And once they know that, they'll come for you. Just like they came for your father. Who will come for me? What are you talking about? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. The hunger in the walls. It's been part of this town since the beginning. The mine was just where it first broke through. Broke through from where? From the other side. The deep place. Your father figured it out. What really happened in that mine. They didn't die in a collapse. They found something down there. Something old. And it's been feeding ever since. Growing stronger. Reaching further. Ethan felt a chill run through him. Feeding on what? On us. On people. Consumes them slowly. Absorbs them into itself. Those whispers you hear? Those are the people it's already taken. Acting as its lure. Ethan thought of the faces in the rock. Contorted in agony. His father's face among them. If you know all this, why are you still in Millhaven? He asked. There was a long pause. I can't leave, Margaret finally said, her voice breaking. None of us who hear the whispers can leave. We've tried. The hunger won't let us go beyond the town limits. But you still can. You weren't born here, not really. You left as a child. You might still be able to escape before it gets its hooks in you completely. How do you know I've heard the whispers? Because you're Earl's son. And the hunger always calls to family first. The line went dead. Ethan immediately went to his car, throwing his few belongings into the trunk. Margaret was right, he needed to get out of this town. Whether her explanation was real or just the shared delusion of a group of disturbed people, something was terribly wrong in Millhaven. As he drove toward the town limits, his radio suddenly turned on by itself, cycling rapidly through stations, catching fragments of songs and voices before settling on static. Through the white noise, Ethan could make out whispers, dozens of overlapping voices speaking his name. "Don't leave, Ethan. We need you. The hunger needs to be fed." He punched the power button, but the radio continued to hiss and whisper. The car began to slow, despite Ethan's foot pressing the gas pedal to the floor. "No, no, no," he muttered, watching the speedometer needle drop from 40 to 30 to 20, even as the engine roared in protest. The sign marking the town limits was just ahead. "Thank you for visiting Millhaven. Come again soon." But his car was now barely crawling. Ethan threw open the door and jumped out, abandoning the vehicle as it came to a complete stop 50 yards short of the town line. He ran, sprinting toward the sign, toward freedom. He made it 20 feet before the ground beneath him began to soften and shift. The asphalt of the road seemed to liquefy, becoming like quicksand beneath his feet. Ethan struggled forward, but each step became more difficult than the last, as if the earth itself was grabbing at his ankles, trying to pull him down. 10 feet from the town line, he fell to his knees, the semi-solid road now gripping him up to his calves. He clawed desperately at the ground, trying to pull himself forward. 5 feet from freedom, the asphalt began to rise around him, forming tendrils that wrapped around his wrists and waist. The surface beneath him opened up, and Ethan found himself sinking into the road as if it were a pool of black water. "Help!" he screamed, though there was no one to hear him on this deserted stretch of highway. "Somebody help me!" As the liquefied asphalt rose to his chest, Ethan saw movement in the trees beyond the town line, a figure emerging from the forest. Sheriff Marion Watts. "Marion!" he cried out. "Help me!" She approached slowly, stopping just on the other side of the invisible boundary. Her expression was one of deep sadness and resignation. "I can't cross back in," she said softly. "I got out 3 days ago. Been living in my car, afraid to go back to my house. Please," Ethan gasped as the black substance reached his neck. "Do something." Marion shook her head, tears in her eyes. "There's nothing I can do. No one who leaves ever comes back. That's how it maintains the balance." "What balance?" "One out, one in. The hunger needs a certain number. Your father realized what was happening. When old Mr. Henderson somehow managed to escape town, the hunger took your father the very next day. That's the pattern." Ethan's mind raced, connecting dots. His father's sudden heart attack, right after sending that final warning letter. The timing of Marion showing up in the woods, just as he was trying to escape. "You knew," he accused, struggling to keep his head above the rising blackness. "You knew all along what was happening in this town." Marion looked away. "Everyone who grows up here knows on some level. We just don't talk about it. Can't talk about it. The hunger doesn't allow it." "Then why tell me now?" "Because you can't escape anymore. And because I'm sorry, Ethan. I led you back to the mine yesterday on purpose. I needed you to see, to become part of it, so I could finally leave." The realization hit him with sickening clarity. "You used me as a replacement." She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I've heard the whispers for 20 years. When your father died, I thought I might have a chance. The hunger sometimes allows an exchange, a Caldwell for a Watts. Our families were both here when they dug that cursed mine, both part of its history." The asphalt was up to Ethan's chin now. He could feel it hardening around his body, turning solid again. "Why?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. "Why is this happening?" Marion stepped back, already turning away. "Because the hunger beneath Millhaven is always starving, Ethan. And it's been feeding on this town for over 100 years. Those were the last words Ethan heard before the blackness covered his face, filling his mouth and nose. He couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, could only feel himself being pulled downward, through the earth, through layers of soil and rock, deeper and deeper. When consciousness returned, Ethan found himself unable to move. Not paralyzed exactly, more like embedded, held in place by something solid all around him. He could see, could breathe somehow, but his body was no longer his own. He was back in the mind chamber, but now from a new perspective, looking outward from the wall itself. The faces he had seen before were all around him, some close enough to touch if he could have moved his arms. His father was there too, just an arm's length away, eyes wide and aware. "Dad," Ethan tried to say, but his mouth wouldn't move. Instead, he felt his thoughts projected outward. "Welcome, son," came his father's response. Not spoken, but somehow transmitted directly into Ethan's mind. "I tried to warn you. What is this place? What's happening to us?" A chorus of voices answered, a harmonious blend of dozens of minds all speaking as one. "We are the whispers of Millhaven. We are the hunger's voice. And now you are too." Ethan tried to scream, but all that emerged was a whisper, joining with the others, calling out to the next unsuspecting soul who might wander too close to the walls. And deep beneath them all, something ancient and patient and eternally hungry continued to feed. In a small roadside motel 30 miles from Millhaven, Sheriff Marion Watts sat on the edge of a bed, staring at her phone. She had been free for 3 days now, had put miles between herself and that accursed town, but the guilt was eating her alive. She pulled up her contacts and found the number for the state police. Her finger hovered over the call button. She could tell them something, some sanitized version of the truth. A cult maybe, or a mass grave. Something to get them to investigate. But as she was about to press call, her phone screen flickered. The contacts app closed itself, and her screen filled with static, like an old television with poor reception. Through the static, she could make out a face forming. Ethan Caldwell's face, his features distorted and in agony. And then beside him, another face appeared, and another, dozens of them crowding her small screen. From the phone speaker came a whisper, a harmonious blend of voices. "You can't escape us, Marion. The hunger reaches everywhere now." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, backing away until she hit the wall. But the wall behind her felt strange. Not solid, but somehow softened, giving slightly under her weight. Marion spun around and saw, to her horror, that the floral patterned wallpaper was rippling, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. And pressing outward from within the wall were faces, familiar faces of people she had known in Millhaven. "The hunger must be fed, Marion," they whispered in unison, "and it's growing." As hands began to emerge from the wall, reaching for her, Marion Watts finally understood the terrible truth. The hunger beneath Millhaven was no longer content to feed on just one small town. It had learned to spread. The quiet after. The first time Ellie Wheeler heard the sound, she was standing at her kitchen sink, watching the last traces of winter snow melt from the branches of the old oak tree in her backyard. It was March in Millfield, Maine, that muddy, uncertain time when the hard freeze loosened its grip but spring hadn't quite found its footing. The sound was subtle, a low, distant hum, more felt than heard, like the bass note of some massive, unseen instrument playing just below the threshold of perception. She might have ignored it entirely if not for the way it made her molars ache. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to her husband Keith, who sat at the kitchen table, face hidden behind his coffee mug and the local paper. "Hear what?" He didn't look up. "That humming, like electricity, but deeper." Keith lowered his paper just enough to reveal his eyes, tired, bloodshot. He hadn't been sleeping well since Ben died 6 months ago. Neither of them had. "Don't hear anything," he said, disappearing behind the paper again. "Probably the refrigerator." But Ellie knew it wasn't the refrigerator. The sound came from outside, from everywhere, and nowhere. She turned back to the window, squinting at the tree line beyond their property. The pines stood silently against the pale morning sky. Nothing moved except melting snow dripping from branches. The sound faded, and she might have forgotten about it entirely if she hadn't noticed what happened to the oak tree. The lowest branch, thick as her thigh and still dusted with snow, suddenly drooped as if caught in a downpour. But there was no rain, only that strange, momentary hum. The branch trembled, then stilled. 3 days later, the branch was dead, leaves brown and withered while the rest of the tree budded with spring green. By April, several people in Millfield had heard the sound. "Like distant thunder," said Marge Connolly at the town meeting. She was in her 70s and had lived in Millfield all her life. "Except it ain't coming from the sky. It's coming from the ground. More like a truck engine idling," Frank Lee, the mechanic, offered. "But there ain't no truck." The town hall was packed. Nearly 100 people had squeezed into the small municipal building. The air was thick with the smell of damp jackets and mud-caked boots. Outside, rain beat against the windows. Town Council Chair Robert Walsh banged his gavel. "Folks, I know you're concerned. We all are. But let's keep things in perspective. A strange noise isn't cause for panic. It's not just noise." Ellie spoke up from her seat near the back. Heads turned. She rarely spoke at these meetings. Hadn't spoken much at all since Ben's funeral. "Things happen when the sound comes." "What kind of things, Mrs. Wheeler?" Walsh asked, a hint of condescension in his tone. "Plants die, but only where the sound is strongest. My oak tree lost a branch. Sally Dinsmore's roses withered overnight. And yesterday I saw birds frozen in place, just hanging in the air for a second, like time stopped. When the sound faded, they dropped dead." A murmur rippled through the room. Walsh's expression shifted from condescension to concern. "We've contacted the university in Portland," he said. "They're sending someone to investigate. Could be seismic activity or some kind of industrial noise from the paper mill in Augusta." "It's 30 miles to Augusta," Frank Lee said, "and it doesn't explain dead birds." "Well, what's your explanation, Frank?" Walsh snapped. Frank opened his mouth, then closed it again. No one had an explanation. Not yet. Dr. Vanessa Chen arrived from Portland State University the following week. She was younger than Ellie expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with short dark hair and the confident demeanor of someone comfortable with scientific instruments but awkward with people. "I'm a geophysicist," she explained as Keith helped her unload equipment from her university-issued van, "specializing in acoustic anomalies." "So you study weird noises," Keith said. He'd agreed to let Dr. Chun set up monitoring equipment in their backyard, near the oak tree. It was the first time in months he'd shown interest in anything. "I study unexplained sound phenomena," she corrected, handing him a metal case, "which usually turn out to have very mundane explanations. Military testing, industrial equipment, sometimes natural gas venting from underground pockets." "And what kills birds mid-flight?" Ellie asked. "Or withers plants?" Dr. Chun met her gaze. "That's what I'm here to find out." Over the next 3 days, as April sunshine finally pushed winter into retreat, Dr. Chun recorded ambient sound levels, took soil samples, and monitored her instruments. She asked questions about the timing and intensity of the sounds, and precisely what people experienced when they heard them. "Most sonic phenomena affect people differently based on age," she explained as she and Ellie sat on the back porch, watching a robin hop cautiously around the equipment. "Children can typically hear higher frequencies than adults. If everyone is hearing this sound regardless of age, that suggests lower frequencies. Infrasound." "What's infrasound?" Ellie asked. "Sound below the normal range of human hearing. We're talking below 20 hertz. Too low to hear properly, but your body can still sense it." Dr. Chun tapped her chest. "You feel it more than hear it. It can cause uneasiness, discomfort, even hallucinations." "I'm not hallucinating," Ellie said firmly. "I didn't say you were, but infrasound can create strange effects. It's been linked to ghost sightings, feelings of dread. The resonant frequency of the human eyeball is around 18 hertz. Exposure can cause visual distortions." "What about the dead branch? The frozen birds?" Dr. Chun didn't answer immediately. Her equipment had recorded nothing unusual so far. "I'm still working on that," she finally said. That night, Ellie woke to the sound again. Stronger now, a physical pressure against her eardrums. Beside her, Keith slept fitfully, his face contorted as if caught in a nightmare. She rose from bed and went to the window. The neighborhood was dark except for a single streetlight at the corner. In its orange glow, she could see leaves and scraps of paper hovering motionless in the air, caught like insects in amber. As she watched, the papers crumbled to dust. The hum intensified. The glass in the window began to vibrate. On her nightstand, a glass of water showed concentric ripples moving from the outside in, defying physics. "Keith," she whispered, not wanting to wake him suddenly. "Keith, it's happening again." He didn't stir. "Keith." She turned and touched his shoulder. His skin was cold. Too cold. "Keith." She shook him harder. His head lolled to the side, eyes open and staring, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Ellie's own scream caught in her throat as the hum crescendoed, pressing against her like a physical weight. The bedroom light flickered on, though she hadn't touched the switch. The bulb burned brighter, brighter, and then darkness. When she could see again, Keith was sitting up in bed, looking bewildered. "Ellie, what's wrong? Why are you standing there?" She collapsed against him, sobbing with relief. I saw." The words wouldn't come. How could she explain what she'd seen when she wasn't sure herself? A nightmare, perhaps, or a hallucination like Dr. Chun had suggested. But the next morning, another branch on the oak tree was dead, and the robins that had been building a nest in the maple tree were gone, leaving behind only a few scattered feathers. The town meeting the following week was more crowded and far less orderly. Dr. Chun presented her findings, or lack thereof. "The instruments have detected periodic low-frequency sound waves," she explained, pointing to a chart projected on the wall. "But nothing that explains the phenomena you've described." "So you're saying we're all making it up?" Frank Lee called out. "No," Dr. Chun said evenly. "I'm saying science doesn't yet have an explanation. I've sent samples to colleagues for analysis." In the meantime, she was interrupted by the sound, louder than ever, a physical presence filling the room. The overhead lights flickered. The projection on the wall distorted, twisted, then went black. And in that moment, Ellie saw it, not with her eyes, but with something deeper, more primitive. A tear, like fabric ripping, in the center of the room. Through it, a glimpse of something vast and cold and ancient. Something that had always been there, just beyond the veil of what humans call reality. Around her, people froze, not in fear, but literally froze, suspended between heartbeats, between breaths. Time itself seemed to catch and hold. All except Dr. Chun, who stared directly at the tear, her face a mask of scientific curiosity mixed with primal terror. "Do you see it?" Ellie managed to whisper. Dr. Chun nodded slowly. "It's a doorway, or a window, into somewhere else." The tear widened, revealing more of what lay beyond. Not darkness exactly, but an absence. A void where the rules of physics, of reality itself, ceased to apply. And moving within that void, shapes that hurt the mind to perceive. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the tear sealed itself. The frozen people jerked back into motion, continuing conversations mid-sentence, unaware anything had happened. Only Ellie, Dr. Chun, and Ellie noticed with a chill 3 children scattered throughout the room seemed to have witnessed the event. The children looked at each other, then at Ellie, their expressions a mixture of fear and strange recognition. "We need to talk," Dr. Chun said quietly. "Not here." They gathered at Ellie's house. Dr. Chun, the 3 children from the meeting, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 12, and, surprisingly, Marge Connolly, who had approached them in the parking lot with knowing eyes. "You all saw it, didn't you?" Marge asked once they were settled in Ellie's living room. The rip in the air, the cold place beyond. The children nodded silently. The oldest boy, whom Ellie recognized as Tommy Wilkins from the elementary school where she used to teach, spoke first. "I've been seeing them for weeks. he said. Little tears, like somebody took scissors to the air. But nobody believes me. I believe you, the girl said. Her name was Lily Chun, Dr. Chen's niece, as it turned out, visiting from Portland. Why us? Ellie asked. Why can we see it when others can't? Dr. Chun had been unusually quiet, furiously making notes in a small black book. Now she looked up. I have a theory. It's unconventional. This whole damn situation is unconventional, Marge said. Let's hear it. The common factor seems to be grief, Dr. Chun said. Recent, significant loss. Am I right? The silence in the room was confirmation enough. Ellie had lost Ben, her only child, 6 months ago to leukemia. Tommy Wilkins's father had died in a factory accident last summer. The other boy, Parker Mills, had lost his twin sister to drowning just before Christmas. Lily Chen's mother, Vanessa's sister, had succumbed to cancer 3 months prior. I lost my Harold 2 years back, Marge said softly. That's not so recent. But the grief stays with you, Dr. Chun said gently. Changes how you see the world. What does grief have to do with tears in reality? Ellie asked. Grief alters brain chemistry, Dr. Chun explained. Creates new neural pathways. In a sense, the grieving brain operates on a different frequency than others. She hesitated. What if that frequency allows us to perceive aspects of reality others can't? To see between dimensions? Sounded absurd. And yet, Ellie found herself nodding. Since Ben's death, she'd often felt as if she were living in a different world than everyone else. A world where colors were muted, where time moved differently, where nothing quite made sense anymore. So what's on the other side? Tommy asked. Is it heaven? Dr. Chun shook her head. I don't think so. From what I glimpsed, it's older, more fundamental, like seeing the scaffolding behind reality. And something's coming through, Ellie said, suddenly certain. Those shapes I saw moving in the tear, they're trying to get in. Or maybe they've always been here, Marge said. And we're just now able to see them. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Keith had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day working at the hardware store he managed, unaware of the meeting that had taken place in his living room hours before. She sat in Ben's room, untouched since his death. The model airplanes still hung from the ceiling. The bookshelf still held his dog-eared collection of science fiction paperbacks. His baseball mitt lay on the dresser where he'd left it after his last game before the diagnosis. The grief was a physical presence, a stone lodged permanently beneath her ribs. But now Dr. Chen's words gave it new meaning. What if her grief wasn't just pain? What if it was also a kind of sight? The hum began again, soft at first, then building. The air in the center of the room seemed to thicken, to gather itself into folds before tearing open. Through the tear, Ellie saw them clearly now, the shapes from the void. Not monsters, exactly. Not anything with a form her mind could properly process. More like autonomous regions of altered physics, places where reality bent and warped around rules she couldn't comprehend. And they were curious about this world, about her. One extended a portion of itself, not a limb, but a protrusion of altered space toward her. She felt no fear, only a deep, penetrating cold as it neared her face. Ben? She whispered, though she knew this wasn't her son, couldn't be her son. The entity paused. Then, impossibly, it shaped itself into something almost human. A silhouette of a small boy, rendered in negative space. Not Ben, but something trying to understand what Ben meant to her. You can see us, it said, though not in words. The meaning simply appeared in her mind. Few can. Only those who dwell partly in the quiet after. The quiet after what? Ellie asked. After loss. After the severance. You exist in two states now. Here and in the quiet. We have always been in the quiet. But now the boundaries thin. Why? What's happening? The entity's form rippled. Your kind has torn so many holes, with your grief, your bombs, your accelerators probing the fundamental nature of matter. The boundaries grow weak. Soon, there will be no separation. Is that what you want? To come through, Want is a human concept. We simply are. But when the boundaries fall completely, we will be here also. And your reality will change. Fundamentally. The dead plants, Ellie realized. The birds. That's what happens when your reality touches ours. Yes, your physics cannot accommodate our presence. Just as smoke displaces air. The implications hit her with the force of a physical blow. If these entities fully entered our world, life as we know it would end. Not in fire or flood, but in a fundamental rewriting of the rules that govern existence. How do we stop it? She asked. The entity's form wavered. Some tears can be mended. Dawn found Ellie, Dr. Chun, and the others gathered in the town cemetery. It had been Marge's suggestion. If grief had opened them to perceiving the tears, perhaps the focal point of that grief would reveal more. Ben's grave was simple. A small headstone with his name, the dates of his too short life, and the words "beloved son" beneath. 6 months of Maine weather had already begun to weather the fresh-cut stone. Ellie knelt and placed her hand on the cold granite. I don't understand what we're supposed to do. Me neither, Tommy said, standing awkwardly by his father's grave several plots away. It's not like we can just stop grieving. Maybe we're not supposed to stop, Dr. Chun said. She had brought no instruments this time. Nothing but herself and a growing acceptance that science alone couldn't explain what was happening. Maybe grief itself is the key, not to close the tears, but to control them, somehow. The sound began again, louder here among the dead. The air shimmered and split, tears appearing simultaneously over multiple graves. Through each tear, the entities watched, waited, their impossible forms shifting and adapting as they studied the humans who could perceive them. They're learning from us? Dr. Chun said, her voice tight with fear and fascination. Evolving to better understand our reality. Which means they're getting closer to breaking through completely, Ellie said. As if in response, one of the tears widened dramatically, and an entity began to emerge more fully than before. The air around it distorted. Nearby flowers blackened and died instantly. The ground itself seemed to recoil, dirt and grass withering in an expanding circle. No! Ellie stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between the entity and the others. You can't come through. You'll destroy everything. The entity paused, its form shimmering with what might have been confusion. We do not destroy, we transform. It is the natural progression. Natural for you, Ellie said. Death for us. The entity's form rippled again. Death is transformation. You understand this. Your grief is proof. And suddenly, Ellie did understand. The entity wasn't wrong. Death was transformation. Ben wasn't gone, he was changed. Her grief had transformed her too, allowing her to perceive what others couldn't. But that didn't mean she had to accept the wholesale transformation of her world. Our grief opened these tears, she said, turning to the others. Maybe our grief can seal them too, not by denying it but by channeling it, directing it. How? Parker Mills asked, his small face pale with fear. Ellie closed her eyes, reaching deep into the well of her grief. Not to escape it, but to embrace it fully. To understand it not as an absence, a hole where Ben had been, but as a presence, a testament to love that continued even after death. She felt rather than saw the others doing the same, each connecting to their personal loss, each finding the point where grief opened into something else. Not acceptance, exactly. Understanding, perhaps. The tears in reality began to shrink, the entities withdrawing, not in retreat but in a kind of recognition, a respect. They're responding, Dr. Chun whispered. It's working. The largest tear, the one through which the entity had begun to emerge, quivered and began to close. But as it did, something unexpected happened. A small tendril extended from the entity, reaching not toward Ellie but toward Ben's grave. Instinctively, Ellie moved to block it, but Dr. Chun caught her arm. Wait, she said. Look, where the tendril touched the grave. A small blue flower bloomed from the winter-dead grass, impossibly vibrant, impossibly alive. The entity's thoughts brushed against Ellie's mind once more. Transformation works both ways. We learn from you as you learn from us. This is not an ending, but a boundary, necessary for both our realities. The tears closed one by one, the sound fading to a whisper, then to nothing. The cemetery was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Summer came to Millfield. The strange hum wasn't gone entirely, but it was changed, less intrusive, less destructive. It came now only at twilight and dawn, the liminal times when boundaries are naturally thinnest. Ellie still heard it, as did the others who had stood in the cemetery that day. But no new deaths followed its appearance, no withering of plants or freezing of birds. Instead, occasionally, small blue flowers would appear in unexpected places, flowers unlike any native Maine species, with a slight luminescence visible only in dim light. Scientists from universities across the country had come and gone, taking measurements, soil samples, recording ambient frequencies. They found elevated electromagnetic readings, unusual radiation patterns, and the flowers, of course, which defied classification. Articles were written, theories proposed. None came close to the truth. Keith noticed the change in Ellie before she noticed it herself. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the lawn, he took her hand. "You're different," he said, "since that day in the cemetery. I can't explain it, but you seem more at peace." Ellie considered this. She still missed Ben with an ache that would never fully heal. But the crushing weight of grief had somehow shifted, become something she could carry rather than something that threatened to bury her. "I still hurt," she said quietly. "I always will. But I understand something now that I didn't before." "What's that?" How could she explain? That reality was vaster and stranger than they'd ever imagined? That grief wasn't just the price of love but a kind of perception, a window into aspects of existence most would never see. That death wasn't an end but a transformation, a shifting from one state of being to another? "That we're not alone," she finally said. "None of us, not even in our deepest loss." As if in response, the hum began, gentle now, almost musical. In the gathering dusk, Ellie thought she glimpsed the faintest shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer pavement. Not a tear, just a thinning, a reminder of what lay beyond. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement, and the shimmer seemed to pulse once in return before fading into the twilight. Keith hadn't noticed, his attention caught by a particularly bright firefly hovering nearby. But Tommy Wilkins, walking his dog past their house, paused and looked directly at the spot where the shimmer had been. He met Ellie's eyes and gave a small, solemn nod of understanding before continuing on his way. The hum faded. Night fell fully over Millfield, and in the darkness of Ellie's backyard, among the roots of the old oak tree, blue flowers opened their luminescent petals to the stars. And the silent watchers. The first time Frank Thurman saw one of the figures standing at the edge of his property, he mistook it for a dead tree. It was early October in Millhaven, Maine, when the mornings were still coated with a heavy mist that rose off Greywater Lake and blanketed the town until midday. Visibility was poor at best. But as Frank stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, squinting through the fog, something about that particular silhouette made his skin prickle. He set down his mug and moved closer to the window, wiping away the condensation with his palm. The figure remained motionless, a dark smudge against the white haze that engulfed his backyard. Frank's property stretched for 2 acres before meeting the dense pine forest that separated his home from the lake. Whatever he was looking at stood at that threshold, half concealed by the tree line. "Just a stump," he muttered to himself. "Or one of those damn scarecrows the Thompson kids keep putting up." But even as he said it, Frank felt the weight of eyes upon him. He turned away from the window and checked his watch. It was nearly 7:30, and he had a town council meeting at 8 o'clock. As the newly appointed town manager of Millhaven, he couldn't afford to be late. Not when half the council already resented him for being an outsider who'd only moved to town 6 months ago. The previous town manager, Harold Crenshaw, had disappeared without a trace back in April. The official story was that Harold had a nervous breakdown and fled town, abandoning his position and his home of 30 years. Frank had been brought in from Portland as his replacement, inheriting not only Harold's job, but also his modest colonial house on the outskirts of town. Frank glanced once more through the window before grabbing his briefcase. The shape was gone. "I'm telling you, there's something not right about those woods," Eliza Kendrick insisted, her wrinkled hands wrapped tightly around her teacup. At 78, she was the oldest member of the town council and had lived in Millhaven her entire life. The council meeting had adjourned 20 minutes ago, but Frank had been cornered by Eliza in the small kitchenette of the town hall. She'd been trying to convince him to postpone the development project at Greywater Lake, a plan that had been in motion long before Frank arrived. "The construction begins next month, Eliza," Frank said gently. "The contracts are signed, the permits approved. It's going to bring jobs and tourism to Millhaven. You think we need outsiders here?" Eliza's eyes narrowed. "Those woods have belonged to this town since before there was a town. There are things in those trees that don't take kindly to being disturbed." Frank suppressed a sigh. He'd heard similar sentiments from other longtime residents. It wasn't unusual for small towns to resist change, to cling to superstitions and folklore. "What things exactly?" he asked, more to humor her than out of genuine curiosity. Eliza leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The Watchers. They've always been there, standing at the edges, watching, waiting. But when people push too far into their territory, they don't just watch anymore." She set down her cup with a clatter. "Ask Martha Crenshaw what happened to her husband." Frank felt a chill run down his spine despite himself. Harold had mental health issues. Everyone knows that. "Everyone says that," Eliza corrected. "Makes it easier to explain why a man who spent 30 years devoted to this town would suddenly vanish without so much as a goodbye note. But Martha knows the truth. Harold saw them too in those last few weeks, standing at the edge of their property, watching." Before Frank could respond, the door to the kitchenette opened, and Mayor Phillips stuck his head in. "Frank, got a minute? We need to discuss the budget for the lake project." Frank nodded, secretly relieved for the interruption. "Sure thing, Mayor. Excuse me, Eliza." The elderly woman gave him a long, hard look. "Be careful going home tonight, Mr. Thurman. The mist will be thick, and they like to come closer when you can't see them clearly." Frank couldn't get Eliza's words out of his head as he drove home that evening. The sun had already set, and a dense fog had indeed rolled in, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead of his headlights. The road to his house wound along the edge of the forest, curves and turns that he'd grown familiar with but still required concentration in these conditions. His high beams reflected off the mist, creating a disorienting white wall. Frank leaned forward in his seat, straining to see the road. As he rounded a bend, his headlights swept across something standing on the shoulder. Frank slammed on the brakes, heart hammering in his chest. His car skidded slightly before coming to a stop. Through the passenger window, no more than 10 feet away, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. But what made Frank's blood run cold was that he couldn't make out any features. The figure was entirely black, as if cut from the darkness itself, a silhouette with no substance. It stood perfectly still, facing the car. Frank's mouth went dry. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For several long seconds, neither he nor the figure moved. Then, slowly, the figure took a step toward the car. Frank slammed his foot on the accelerator, tires squealing as he sped away. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but the figure was already swallowed by the fog. When he finally pulled into his driveway, Frank sat in his car for several minutes, waiting for his heartbeat to return to normal. The fog swirled around the house, making familiar shapes seem alien and threatening. He scanned the edge of the property but saw nothing unusual. "Get it together," he muttered to himself. "You're letting Eliza's stories get to you." Inside, Frank poured himself a generous glass of whiskey and tried to focus on reviewing documents for the lake development project. But his eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the darkness beyond the glass. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overcame his unease, and he headed upstairs to bed. As he was drawing the curtains in his bedroom, movement caught his eye. Frank froze, staring out into the backyard. There, at the edge of the forest, stood not one but three dark figures, their elongated forms barely distinguishable from the trees. They were perfectly still, facing the house. Frank quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Could they be teenagers playing a prank? Some kind of weird scarecrows? Or was he simply seeing things that weren't there? He considered calling the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. What would he say? That there were creepy shadow people standing at the edge of his property? They'd think he was drunk or crazy. Instead, Frank double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, then lay in bed with the lights on, listening to the eerie silence of the house. Eventually, fatigue claimed him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. He dreamed of standing in a forest clearing, surrounded by tall, thin figures that swayed slightly despite the absence of wind. They had no faces, yet somehow Frank knew they were watching him. In the dream, he tried to run, but his feet sank into the soft earth, holding him in place as the figures began to move toward him, their movements jerky and unnatural. Frank woke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. Pale dawn light filtered through the curtains. For a moment, he lay there, heart racing, trying to shake off the lingering terror of the dream. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Top, top, top. It was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the kitchen. Frank sat up slowly, straining to listen. Top, top, top. Like a finger gently rapping against glass. "You look like hell," remarked Linda Phillips, the mayor's wife and local physician, when Frank stopped by her clinic later that morning. He'd made an appointment claiming insomnia, but what he really wanted was someone rational to talk to. "Haven't been sleeping well," Frank admitted, sitting on the examination table. "Weird dreams, and I think I might be seeing things." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Seeing things? Like hallucinations?" Frank hesitated. "Not exactly. More like figures. Shadow people, I guess you could call them. Standing at the edge of my property." He watched her face carefully, looking for signs of alarm or concern. Instead, Linda's expression remained professionally neutral as she checked his blood pressure. "Hypnagogic hallucinations," she said after a moment. "They happen in that state between wakefulness and sleep, especially common in people under stress." She removed the blood pressure cuff. "And I'd say taking over Harold's position qualifies as stressful. The town hasn't exactly welcomed you with open arms." Frank nodded, relieved by the medical explanation. "Last night I could have sworn I heard tapping on my kitchen window, but when I went to check, there was nothing there." Linda made a note in his chart. "I'm going to prescribe something to help you sleep, and maybe consider putting up some security cameras if that would make you feel safer. You don't think I'm losing my mind? I think you're overworked, sleep-deprived, and living alone in a strange town where people keep telling you spooky stories." Linda gave him a reassuring smile. "Take the medication, get some rest, and try not to let Millhaven's local legends get under your skin." As Frank was leaving the clinic, prescription in hand, Linda called after him. "Oh, and Frank, maybe stay away from Martha Crenshaw for now. She's still processing Harold's disappearance. Might not be helpful to hear her theories about it." Of course, Frank went straight to Martha Crenshaw's house after leaving the clinic. Martha lived in a small bungalow on the other side of town, far from the lake and the surrounding forest. Her garden, once the pride of the neighborhood according to local gossip, had fallen into neglect, weeds choking the flower beds. She answered the door on the third knock, a small woman with tired eyes and premature gray streaking her brown hair. Frank introduced himself, explaining that he'd taken over her husband's position. "I know who you are," Martha said flatly. "You're living in our house." "The town's house," Frank corrected gently. "It comes with the position." Martha stared at him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the bungalow was cluttered with boxes, as if she were in the middle of moving or unpacking. "I've been sorting through Harold's things," she explained, noticing Frank's glance. "5 months later, and I'm still finding his belongings tucked away in odd places." They sat in a small living room where every surface was covered with framed photographs. Many featured Harold, a round-faced man with kind eyes and a receding hairline. "I wanted to ask you about Harold's departure," Frank said carefully. Martha's expression hardened. "You mean his nervous breakdown? That's what they're all saying, isn't it? That my husband of 27 years suddenly went crazy and ran off without a word. What do you think happened?" Martha got up and went to a bookshelf, returning with a worn leather journal. Harold kept meticulous records, daily entries about town business, personal notes, observations. He never missed a day. She opened the journal to a marked page. "Until the last week before he disappeared. Then this." She handed the journal to Frank. Instead of the neat handwriting that filled the previous pages, the final entries consisted of crude drawings. Tall, thin figures standing among trees. Each page contained more figures than the last, drawn with increasingly frantic, heavy strokes that sometimes tore through the paper. The final page simply read, "They're getting closer." Frank felt his mouth go dry. "Martha, what are these?" "The Watchers," she whispered. Harold started seeing them after the town approved the lake development project. At first, it was just one, standing at the edge of our property. Then more appeared. Each night, they'd get a little closer to the house. "Did you see them too?" Martha shook her head. "Not at first. I thought Harold was working too hard, that the stress was getting to him. But the night he disappeared, I saw one, standing right outside our bedroom window. No face, just darkness. And it was so tall, Frank. Our bedroom was on the 2nd floor." Frank's mind flashed to the figures he'd seen at the edge of his own property. "What did you do?" "I screamed. Harold pulled me away from the window. We slept in the guest room that night, away from the windows." Martha's voice cracked. The next morning, Harold went to work early, said he needed to stop the lake project before it was too late. "That was the last time I saw him." Frank handed the journal back to her, his hands slightly unsteady. "Martha, I don't mean to be insensitive, but is it possible that Harold was experiencing some kind of psychotic break? These drawings. I found these in every room of the house after he vanished," Martha interrupted, pulling something from her pocket and placing it on the coffee table between them. It was a small figure roughly carved from dark wood. It depicted a tall, thin humanoid shape with elongated limbs and no facial features. Harold made dozens of them in those final days. Said it was important to acknowledge them, that they'd been here long before us and would be here long after we're gone. Martha's eyes filled with tears. The police found his car parked at the edge of the forest by the lake. No signs of struggle. No body. Nothing. Frank stared at the wooden figure, feeling a cold weight settling in his stomach. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're living in our house now. And if you're asking these questions, it means you've seen them too." Martha leaned forward. "They've already started watching you, haven't they?" Frank installed security cameras that afternoon, placing them to cover every approach to the house, particularly the edge of the forest. The rational part of his brain told him this was an overreaction, that Martha Crenshaw was grieving and looking for meaning in her husband's likely suicide or mental breakdown. But another part, a more primitive part, couldn't shake the image of those dark figures standing at the tree line. He also filled the prescription Linda had given him, hopeful that a proper night's sleep would clear his head. That evening, Frank found himself drawn to Harold's home office, a room he'd been using primarily for storage since moving in. He began going through the previous town manager's papers more carefully than he had when he first arrived, looking for anything related to the lake development project. In a locked drawer, which Frank forced open with a letter opener, he found a folder labeled Greywater Historical Society. Inside were photocopies of old newspaper clippings, historical photographs, and handwritten accounts. all relating to the lake and surrounding forest. One yellowed newspaper article from 1879 described the disappearance of 7 loggers who had been clearing the forest near the lake. They vanished over the course of a week, one by one, with survivors reporting tall figures watching from between the trees. A photograph from 1923 showed a group of men standing proudly in front of the newly built Millhaven Dam, which had expanded the natural lake to provide power for the growing town. Frank scrutinized the image and felt his blood run cold. In the background, partially obscured by trees, stood what appeared to be an unusually tall, thin figure. The most recent document was a letter from the Historical Society to Harold, dated just 2 weeks before his disappearance. Harold, I've completed the research you requested regarding the indigenous history of the Greywater Lake region. The Abenaki people called the area the place of silent ones and considered it forbidden ground. Their oral histories speak of tall entities that guarded ancient burial sites near the water. The tribe avoided the area entirely, warning that those who disturbed the silent ones would be taken into the spaces between trees. I must advise against proceeding with the development project. Some things are better left undisturbed. Regards, Professor James Elliott, University of Maine. Frank set down the papers, his mind racing. Harold had clearly been investigating the legends surrounding the lake before his disappearance. Had he found something that convinced him the stories were real? Or had his research simply fed a developing paranoia? A soft chime from Frank's laptop interrupted his thoughts. One of the security cameras had detected movement. Frank clicked on the notification. The camera covering the back of the property showed a clear image of the forest edge in the gathering dusk. At first, Frank saw nothing unusual. Then a slight movement caught his eye. Something tall and dark was standing partially concealed behind a pine tree, almost indistinguishable from the trunk except for its unnatural stillness. As Frank watched, another figure emerged from between the trees. Then another, and another. He counted 7 in total, spread out along the tree line, all facing the house. Facing him. Frank's first instinct was to call the police. But as he reached for his phone, one of the figures moved. Unlike its earlier, almost imperceptible movement, this was sudden and jarring. One moment it was at the edge of the forest. The next it stood halfway across the yard, its impossible height and thinness clearly visible against the evening sky. Frank dropped his phone, heart hammering in his chest. On screen, another figure lurched forward, covering an impossible distance in what appeared to be a single, stuttering movement, like frames missing from a film. They were coming toward the house. Frank slammed his laptop shut and ran to check that all doors and windows were locked. Peering through the blinds, he could see nothing in the gathering darkness outside. The security lights should have come on if anything was moving in the yard, but they remained off. His phone rang, making him jump. It was Mayor Phillips. "Frank, I just got a call from Martha Crenshaw," the mayor said without preamble. "She says you visited her today, asking questions about Harold." "I did," Frank admitted, still peering through the blinds. "I'm concerned about some of the circumstances surrounding his disappearance." "Let me be clear," Phillips said, his voice tight. "Harold had a breakdown. It happens. The official investigation is closed. The last thing this town needs is for you to start stirring up rumors and frightening Martha with talk of... What did she call them? The Watchers. Mayor, I think there's something. No, Frank. Listen to me carefully. The lake development project is the most important economic opportunity this town has seen in 50 years. We can't afford any delays or complications. Whatever Harold thought he found, whatever stories Martha has been telling you, let it go. There was a strange urgency in the mayor's voice that made Frank uneasy. "Sir, with all due respect, I think we should at least look into the historical significance of..." "The decision has been made," Phillips interrupted. "The project moves forward. I expected better from you, Frank. I thought you understood what this town needs." "What this town needs is to understand what happened to Harold," Frank insisted. "And what's happening in those woods." There was a long pause before the mayor spoke again, his voice now eerily calm. "They're just stories, Frank. Old legends meant to keep people away from valuable land. Don't let them get to you like Harold did. The call ended abruptly. Frank stood in the darkened house, phone in hand, feeling increasingly isolated. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mayor knew more than he was letting on. The house creaked and settled around him. Frank made his way back to the office and hesitated before reopening his laptop. The security camera feed showed the yard was empty once more. The figures had retreated to the tree line. 7 dark silhouettes standing motionless at the edge of the forest. Frank took one of the sleeping pills Linda had prescribed and went to bed early, drawing the curtains tight against the night. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of dark figures surrounding his bed, their featureless forms leaning over him, reaching out with impossibly long fingers. He awoke to silence. Not the normal quiet of early morning, but a complete absence of sound. No birds chirping, no distant traffic, not even the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Frank sat up slowly, disoriented. Pale light filtered through the curtains, suggesting it was already well into morning. He reached for his phone on the nightstand to check the time, but it wouldn't turn on. A power outage, he thought. That would explain the silence and his dead phone. But when he tried the bedside lamp, it clicked on immediately. Frowning, Frank got out of bed and went to the window. He hesitated before pulling back the curtain, just enough to peek outside. The fog was back, thicker than ever, a white wall that obscured everything beyond his immediate yard. It seemed to press against the windows, as if trying to find a way in. Frank dressed quickly and went downstairs to check his laptop. The security camera feeds were still active, but they showed nothing but white mist in every direction. His internet connection was down, and his cell phone still wouldn't power on despite being fully charged the night before. He was effectively cut off. Frank made coffee and tried to think logically. The fog would lift eventually. The cell service would return. There was no reason to panic. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed overnight. The soft tapping started again. Top, top, top. This time it was coming from the front door. Frank froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully and moved toward the entry hall, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silent house. Top, top, top. It was a gentle, almost polite sound. The sound of someone or something requesting entry. Who's there? Frank called, not approaching the door. No answer, just another series of taps, slightly louder this time. Frank considered his options. He could ignore it, wait it out. But what if it was someone from town, coming to check on him because of the fog or the communications outage? Cautiously, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing but white mist. Then a dark shape moved into view, too close to the door, too tall to be fully visible through the peephole. Just a section of what appeared to be a black, featureless surface. Frank stumbled backward, his heart racing. The tapping resumed, more insistent now. Top, top, top. He retreated to the kitchen, trying to control his breathing. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. He was still asleep, still dreaming. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, Frank felt a surge of relief. Then came a new sound, a slow, scraping noise from the direction of the living room. Frank grabbed a knife from the counter and moved cautiously toward the sound. The living room was empty, but the noise continued, now clearly coming from the window. Frank approached slowly, knife raised. Through the fog-shrouded glass, he could make out a long, dark shape, like a finger, but too thin, too jointed, scraping gently against the pane. As he watched, frozen in terror, the glass began to frost over from the outside, crackling patterns spreading across the surface. Frank backed away, then turned and ran upstairs. He needed to get out to reach town somehow. The garage was attached to the house. If he could make it to his car, he might be able to drive through the fog to safety. He grabbed his keys and jacket, then hesitated. The journal, Harold's research. If he was going to convince anyone of what was happening, he needed evidence. Frank rushed back to the office and gathered the folder of historical documents, stuffing them into his jacket pocket. As he turned to leave, he noticed that his laptop screen had come to life. On the display, one of the security cameras showed a figure standing in the driveway, directly in front of the garage door. It was impossibly tall and thin, its elongated limbs hanging motionless at its sides. 7 more figures emerged from the fog, surrounding the house at evenly spaced intervals. They were waiting for him. The house phone rang, startling Frank so badly he nearly dropped the knife. After 4 rings, it went to voicemail, and Martha Crenshaw's voice filled the room. "Frank, it's Martha. I know what's happening. The same thing happened to Harold. They're isolating you, cutting you off. Listen to me, don't try to run. That's what Harold did, and they took him. You need to acknowledge them. Make the offerings like the original settlers learned to do. I'm coming to help you, but it'll take time to get through this fog. Just stay inside and..." The message cut off abruptly, replaced by a harsh static that gradually resolved into a rhythmic sound. "Top, top, top." Frank slammed his hand down on the machine, silencing it. He was trapped, surrounded by entities he couldn't begin to understand, with no way to call for help. The temperature in the house was dropping rapidly. Frank could see his breath misting in front of him as frost began to form on the inside of the windows. The cold seemed to radiate from the glass, as if something on the other side was pulling the warmth from the house. He needed a plan. If he couldn't escape, he had to find a way to hold out until help arrived. Martha was coming if she could be believed, but how long would that take? And what had she meant about offerings? Frank returned to Harold's office, searching frantically through the papers for any mention of offerings or how to appease these entities. He found nothing helpful, just more historical accounts of disappearances and vague warnings. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the house into a gray half-light filtered through the frosted windows. The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. Frank huddled in the attic, knife clutched in his trembling hand, listening to the sounds of movement in the house below. After the window shattered, he'd fled upstairs, pulling down the attic ladder and sealing himself in the small, dusty space. That had been hours ago, or maybe days. It was impossible to tell time in the perpetual gray twilight that permeated the house. The fog outside hadn't lifted, and the creatures, the watchers, had entered the house. He could hear them moving about, their movements accompanied by a strange, discordant whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Occasionally, something would scrape against the attic hatch as if testing it. Frank had found an old box of Harold's possessions stored in the attic, including more of the small wooden carvings Martha had shown him. They were crude representations of the Watchers, each one slightly different but all capturing the essential wrongness of their proportions. Among the carvings was a sealed envelope addressed to the next town manager. With unsteady hands, Frank had opened it to find a letter from Harold. "To whoever follows me, if you're reading this, then you've seen them too. The Watchers. They've been here since before the town was founded. The original settlers thought they were forest spirits and made offerings to appease them, food, livestock, and eventually people. The practice died out in the late 1800s, and the Watchers retreated deeper into the forest. But they never left. They've been watching, waiting for someone to disturb their territory again. The lake development project crosses boundaries that should not be crossed. I tried to stop it, but the council wouldn't listen. Too much money involved, too many promises made. When I realized I couldn't stop the project, I tried to run. That was my mistake. They don't let you leave once they've marked you. They take you to the spaces between the trees, where time and distance don't work the same way. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But there might still be hope for you. The offerings, they must be acknowledged. They must be appeased. Harold." Frank had searched the box further, finding a small leather-bound book that appeared to be much older than anything else in the attic. It contained hand-drawn maps of the area around the lake, with certain locations marked with strange symbols. There were descriptions of rituals, offerings to be made at specific sites around the water. One passage stood out. "The silent ones do not forgive trespass, but they can be appeased with proper acknowledgement of their dominion. The carved likeness must be placed at the heart of their territory, accompanied by the blood of the trespasser. Not enough to kill, but enough to show contrition. If accepted, the fog will lift, and the watchers will retreat. If rejected, the entry ended there, the remaining pages torn out. Frank looked at the wooden figures scattered around him. Harold had been making these as offerings, but he tried to run instead of completing the ritual. And now, a loud thud from directly below made Frank jump. They were in the hallway outside the attic now. Getting closer, he needed to make a decision. Try to wait them out, hoping Martha or someone else would come to his rescue. Or attempt to follow Harold's discovered ritual, venture out into the fog, and try to reach the lake. The attic had shuddered as something heavy pressed against it from below. Frank made his choice. The fog was alive. That was the only way Frank could describe it as he stumbled through the white haze, clutching one of Harold's wooden carvings in his bloodied hand. He'd cut his palm deliberately, letting the blood soak into the wooden figure as the book had instructed. Getting out of the house had been surprisingly easy once he'd made his decision. The watchers had withdrawn, creating a path for him to follow, a corridor of slightly less dense fog leading away from the house and toward the lake. But they weren't gone. Frank could sense them moving alongside him, tall shadows flickering at the edges of his vision. Watching, waiting. The map from the leather book was clutched in his other hand, though it was hardly necessary. The path through the fog seemed predetermined, pulling him forward toward the heart of their territory. A small island in the center of Greywater Lake, marked on the old map with a symbol that resembled a doorway. Frank had no boat, but as he reached the shore, he found the water had receded, revealing a narrow land bridge to the island that shouldn't have existed. The lake development plans he'd reviewed showed the water was at least 15 feet deep in this area. The island itself was little more than a rocky outcropping, perhaps 30 feet across. At its center stood a circle of ancient standing stones, weathered by centuries of exposure. They resembled crude doorways, each one formed by two vertical stones supporting a horizontal lintel. Between the stones, the fog swirled in unnatural patterns, creating the illusion of depth where there should be only air. Frank approached the central stone doorway, the wooden carving held out before him. The whispering that had followed him through the forest grew louder, more urgent. "I acknowledge you," Frank said, his voice sounding small in the vast silence. "This place is yours. The development project will be stopped." He placed the bloodied carving at the base of the stone doorway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fog between the stones darkened, condensing into a tall, thin silhouette. It stepped forward, out of the doorway, its movements stuttering and wrong. Up close, Frank could see that what he had taken for featureless darkness was actually a surface of constantly shifting shadows, like thousands of tiny movements happening simultaneously. The figure extended one impossibly long arm, pointing not at Frank but back toward the shore. Frank turned to look and saw a human figure struggling through the fog toward the island. "Frank, don't do it," Martha Crenshaw's voice carried across the water. "That's not the way. Harold tried that too." The whispering around Frank intensified, drowning out Martha's words. The watcher moved closer, its arm still extended toward the shore. "What do you want?" Frank asked, his voice trembling. The whispering coalesced into a single word, spoken not aloud but directly into his mind. "Replacement." With sudden clarity, Frank understood. The offerings weren't objects or blood. They were people. The town had been sacrificing its managers to these entities for generations, one after another, to keep them appeased and contained. Mayor Phillips had known. The council had known. They'd brought Frank in as an outsider, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone to take Harold's place. Not just as town manager, but as an offering. Martha was almost at the island now, waving frantically. "They want a gatekeeper, Frank. Someone to stand between worlds. That's what happened to Harold." The watcher's arm swung toward Frank, its elongated fingers almost brushing his face. It was waiting for his decision. Frank looked at Martha, then back at the dark figure before him. "If I agree, if I become the replacement, will the town be safe? Will the lake remain undisturbed?" The whispering came again. Until the next trespass. It wasn't a permanent solution, just a postponement. Sooner or later, someone else would push too far, and the cycle would begin again. But for now, for Martha, for the town, for whoever would have been the next sacrifice, he could end this. "I accept," Frank said. The watcher's hand closed around his wrist, its touch like ice burning into his skin. The fog surged around them, pouring between the standing stones, forming a vortex that pulled at Frank's clothes and hair.
No.
Martha screamed, finally reaching the island. "Frank, don't," but it was already happening. Frank felt himself stretching, changing, becoming something not quite human. The world around him shifted, revealing spaces between spaces, times between times. "Tell them," he managed to say as the transformation took hold, his voice becoming distant and hollow. "Tell them to leave this place alone." Martha fell to her knees on the rocky ground, watching in horror as Frank's body elongated, his limbs stretching impossibly thin, his features blurring into shadow. The process seemed to both take an eternity and happen in an instant, time behaving strangely in this in-between place. When it was finished, what remained of Frank Thurman stood among the watchers, a tall, dark silhouette barely distinguishable from the others except for the faintest remnant of human posture. The fog began to dissipate, revealing 7 more figures standing in a circle around the island, their attention now fixed on Martha. "He chose," came the whispered words in her mind. "You may go. The agreement stands." Martha stumbled backward, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure that had been Frank. For just a moment, she thought she saw something familiar in its posture, a slight tilt of its head that seemed almost apologetic. Then the fog closed in again, and when it finally cleared, Martha stood alone on the shore of Greywater Lake. The island remained, but the standing stones and the watchers were gone, retreated back to whatever space they occupied between this world and somewhere else. The official statement is that town manager Frank Thurman has resigned his position due to personal reasons. Mayor Phillips announced at the emergency council meeting 3 days later, "We'll begin the search for a replacement immediately." Martha Crenshaw sat in the back of the town hall, listening as the council seamlessly incorporated this new disappearance into the town's narrative. Just as they had with Harold. Just as they had with every town manager who got too close to the truth. In related news, the mayor continued, his voice carefully neutral. The Greywater Lake Development Project has been postponed indefinitely due to environmental concerns. The area will be designated a protected wildlife sanctuary. A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. The project had been controversial, some eager for the economic benefits it would bring, others wary of disturbing the lake and its surroundings. Martha knew the real reason for the cancellation. The agreement had been renewed, the sacrifice accepted. The watchers would retreat to the spaces between the trees, content to observe from a distance once more. Until the next time. After the meeting, Martha approached Eliza Kendrick, who had watched the proceedings with knowing eyes. "How long have you known?" Martha asked quietly. The elderly woman sighed. "My grandfather was mayor when they made the first formal arrangement in 1923. The dam project disturbed them, you see. People started disappearing. The town was desperate." She looked at Martha with sad eyes. "Every generation thinks they can outsmart the old ways, push a little further, take a little more. And every time we learn the same lesson. This can't go on forever," Martha insisted. "Sooner or later, someone will ask too many questions. The outside world will notice. Perhaps," Eliza conceded. "But not today, not tomorrow. For now, the watchers are satisfied." Martha thought of Frank and Harold, of all the others who had been transformed into the silent guardians of the threshold between worlds. Were they still aware? Did they remember their humanity? Or had they been completely absorbed into whatever ancient consciousness existed in those tall, dark figures? "I'm leaving Millhaven," Martha said. "I can't stay here knowing what I know." Eliza nodded, unsurprised. "Many have left over the years. But remember, dear, they'll be watching. They always watch those who know their secret. Distance won't matter to them." Martha shivered, remembering the horrible stretching of Frank's body, the way his features had dissolved into shadow. What happens if I tell someone? If I try to expose this? No one would believe you, Eliza said simply. And even if they did, what then? Government investigators? Scientists? More development? More disturbances? She shook her head. The cycle would start again with more victims, more transformations. Better to keep the balance as it is. As Martha left the town hall, the evening was drawing in, shadows lengthening between buildings. She hurried toward her car, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. At the edge of the municipal parking lot, where the trees began, she saw it. A tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still among the pines. Watching, waiting. Martha couldn't tell if it was Frank or Harold, or some ancient entity that had been standing guard since before humans walked these lands. Perhaps it didn't matter. They were all watchers now, silent sentinels at the boundaries between worlds. She got into her car and drove away from Millhaven, knowing in her heart she would never truly escape. The watchers would follow her in dreams, in the corner of her eye, in the shadows that stretched too long in the evening light. They would always be there, watching. 6 months later, a real estate agent showed a pleasant colonial house on the outskirts of Millhaven to a young woman from Boston. "It's a lovely property," the agent said cheerfully. "Belongs to the town, actually. Comes with the town manager position, which has just opened up again. The previous occupant had to leave rather suddenly. Health reasons, I believe." The woman walked through the house, admiring the spacious rooms and the large windows that looked out over the backyard toward the dense pine forest beyond. "What's out there?" she asked, gesturing toward the trees. "Oh, that's town property as well. Leads down to Greywater Lake. Beautiful spot. Protected land. So no development allowed. Just pristine Maine wilderness." The woman nodded, moving closer to the window. "I think I'll take it. The house feels watched over somehow. Safe." "Wonderful," the agent exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. "The town council will be pleased. They've had such trouble keeping managers lately." As the agent busied herself with paperwork, the woman continued to gaze out at the forest. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the trees, creating strange patterns of light and dark. For just a moment, she thought she saw something move at the tree line. A tall, thin shape that didn't quite match the surrounding pines. But when she blinked, it was gone. Just her imagination, surely. A trick of the light. The agent touched her arm, startling her. "Everything all right, Miss Phillips?" "Yes," said Linda Phillips, the mayor's daughter, turning away from the window with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything's perfect. I've been looking for a place like this my whole life. Somewhere I belong." Behind her, at the edge of the forest, 7 dark figures stood motionless among the trees. Watching, waiting. The agreement would continue. For now.